It began at the edge of the world, where land, sea, and sky narrowed into a single question that no one wanted to answer. Okinawa was not just another island. It was the last barrier, the final stepping stone between the Allied armies and the Japanese home islands themselves. Everything about it carried weight: its size, its population, its terrain, and what its capture would mean. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had already revealed how brutal it could be. Okinawa would reveal how much worse it still had to become. From the outset, this battle was different. It was not fought over an empty outcrop of rock. It was fought on farms, villages, ridges, and caves. It was fought among civilians who had nowhere to go. Okinawa was home to hundreds of thousands of people, and when the invasion came, they were trapped between an empire that demanded sacrifice and an enemy advancing with overwhelming force. The island would not just be contested, it would be consumed. The Allied landings began almost quietly. No immediate storm of resistance. No beachhead chaos like earlier assaults. Just movement inland under an uneasy calm. That calm was intentional. The Japanese defenders had learned. They did not intend to throw themselves into the sea to stop the landings. Instead, they withdrew into prepared positions in the south, deep, layered defenses built into ridges, hills, and limestone caves. The plan was not to repel the invasion outright. It was to bleed it. What followed was a battle defined by endurance rather than speed. Rain turned the ground into mud that swallowed vehicles. Heat and humidity drained strength. Disease spread as fast as exhaustion. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every ridge became a fortress. Every cave had to be cleared individually. Positions thought taken erupted again. The front line shifted not by miles, but by yards earned at enormous cost. Above it all, the sky was never empty. Kamikaze attacks struck the Allied fleet relentlessly. Ships burned offshore. Medics worked as decks filled with wounded. The sea itself became a battlefield, where sailors faced death without ever seeing the enemy who struck them. Okinawa was fought everywhere at once, on land, at sea, and in the air, with no place to rest. For the soldiers on the ground, the fighting became deeply personal. Flamethrowers and grenades were used at close range. Caves became tombs. Rain filled foxholes until there was nowhere left to stand. The Japanese defenders fought knowing they would not survive. The goal was not victory, it was attrition. Every casualty inflicted was meant to echo beyond the island itself, shaping decisions yet to be made. And civilians suffered beyond measure. Families hid in caves alongside soldiers. Many were coerced, trapped, or killed. The line between battlefield and home vanished completely. Okinawa became one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, not because of a single moment, but because of how long it lasted and how completely it consumed everyone caught within it. By the time the fighting ended, the numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers dead on both sides. Hundreds of thousands of civilians killed or displaced. An island shattered beyond recognition. Okinawa was captured, but at a cost that forced a terrible reckoning. The battle showed exactly what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would look like, and the world recoiled from the answer. Okinawa did not end the war, but it ended any illusion about how the war could end. It shaped decisions made far beyond the island. It weighed heavily on commanders and leaders. It stood as a warning written in mud, fire, and human suffering. Tonight, we return to that final threshold, to the ridges soaked in rain and blood, to the caves where fear and resolve collided, to the battle that forced history to confront its own limits, to Okinawa, where the end of the war came into focus, at a cost no one could ignore. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening all the way through, if these long, careful journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or understand the world a little more deeply, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time, quietly, thoughtfully, and with respect for the people who lived these moments. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting content. You're helping keep this kind of calm, immersive storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, peace, or simply somewhere steady to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. settle in. This is the Battle of Okinawa, November 14th, 1944. Inside a secure briefing room at the United States Navy headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz stands before a wall-sized map of the Pacific. His finger traces a line from the recently captured Philippines, across open ocean, to a slender island shaped like a dragon's tail. 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, 60 miles long. The room falls silent. Every officer present understands what this means. The island of Okinawa, a name most Americans cannot pronounce, has just become the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific War. What happens here will determine not just the outcome of the war, but how many American sons will die before the rising sun finally sets. The planners don't know it yet, but they're designing what will become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Campaign, a 3-month nightmare that will redefine the meaning of sacrifice. The strategic calculus is brutally simple. Since 1942, American forces have been leapfrogging across the Pacific, seizing islands to build airfields ever closer to Japan. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each name written in blood, each battle bringing B-29 bombers closer to Tokyo. But there's a problem that keeps generals awake at night. Even from recently captured Iwo Jima, bombers can barely reach Japan's industrial heartland, and they certainly can't provide air cover for an invasion. They need something closer, something bigger. Okinawa offers what no other island can: multiple airfields already built, deep harbors for the fleet, and most critically, proximity. At 340 miles from Kyushu, Japan's southernmost home island, Okinawa puts fighters and medium bombers within easy range. More than that, it provides the perfect staging ground for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan itself. Without Okinawa, invading Japan becomes exponentially more difficult. With it, Japan's defeat becomes inevitable. But Okinawa is not just another dot on the map. The Ryukyu Islands, of which Okinawa is the largest, occupy a unique position in East Asian history. Neither quite Japanese nor entirely independent, Okinawa was once the Kingdom of Ryukyu, a tributary state that traded with China while maintaining its own culture and language. Japan forcibly annexed the islands in 1879, spending decades trying to erase Okinawan identity and replace it with Japanese nationalism. By 1945, Okinawa's 450,000 civilians find themselves trapped between empires considered second-class citizens by Japan, yet forced to demonstrate absolute loyalty to the emperor. They speak a language Tokyo considers barbaric. They practice customs Japan tried to suppress. And now, their island home sits directly in the path of total war. These people, who never asked to be part of anyone's empire, are about to become collateral damage in a conflict between giants. The intelligence reports landing on Admiral Nimitz's desk paint a sobering picture. Okinawa dwarfs every previous Pacific invasion target. Iwo Jima, that volcanic rock that cost nearly 7,000 American dead, measures just 8 square miles. Okinawa stretches across 463 square miles, roughly the size of Guam, but with far more complex terrain. Mountains bisect the island. Coral ridges form natural fortifications. Cave systems honeycomb the limestone bedrock. And unlike the barren moonscape of Iwo Jima, Okinawa's southern half contains cities, villages, farms, and hundreds of thousands of civilians who will complicate every military operation. The northern two-thirds consists of heavily forested mountains perfect for guerrilla warfare. Aerial reconnaissance photographs reveal Japanese defensive preparations on a scale never before seen: concrete pillboxes, artillery positions, miles of interconnected tunnels. The intelligence officers estimate 75,000 Japanese troops defending the island, though this number will prove tragically conservative. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff study the Okinawa proposal with grim determination. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall reviews casualty projections from recent battles. Iwo Jima, 7,000 dead in 36 days. Peleliu, 2,000 dead for an island that was supposed to fall in 4 days. The pattern is clear as American forces approach the Japanese homeland. The enemy fights with increasing desperation. Marshall's analysts run the numbers for Okinawa. 60 miles of hostile territory, perhaps 100,000 defenders if Japanese estimates are wrong, hundreds of thousands of civilians. The conservative estimate suggests 30,000 casualties. The pessimistic projection reaches twice that number. Either way, Okinawa will be expensive. But the alternative, invading Japan without this stepping stone, could cost 500,000 American lives. The decision is made. Operation Iceberg will proceed. L-Day, landing day, is set for April 1st, 1945, April Fool's Day. The irony is not lost on anyone. Across the Pacific, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters receives intelligence that confirms their worst fears. American forces, having secured the Philippines, are turning their attention northward. The destination is obvious. Okinawa must be next. In Tokyo, military planners understand the strategic reality with crystal clarity. Lose Okinawa, and American bombers will turn Japan's cities to ash. Lose Okinawa, and the invasion of the sacred homeland becomes not a possibility but a certainty. Emperor Hirohito himself takes unprecedented interest in the defense plans. The 32nd Army, garrisoning Okinawa, receives a stark directive from Tokyo: delay the American invasion of Japan by at least 90 days. How they accomplish this is left to local commanders. What isn't stated, but what every Japanese officer understands, is that the 32nd Army is expected to die to the last man. There will be no evacuation, no relief force, no negotiated surrender. Okinawa's defenders are being asked to sacrifice themselves to buy time for the homeland, and every single one of them knows it. The human dimension of these strategic decisions reveals itself in thousands of small moments. In California, 19-year-old Marine Private Eugene Sledge trains for an amphibious assault he's been told will be the big one. He's already survived Peleliu, already seen things that wake him screaming. Now he's being told to prepare for something even worse. In Kansas, an Army infantryman writes to his mother, carefully avoiding mention of where he's going, knowing only that the entire 10th Army is mobilizing for an operation larger than D-Day. In Okinawa, a 62-year-old farmer watches Japanese soldiers fortifying the hills behind his village, commandeering food, and conscripting his 16-year-old son into a militia unit armed with sharpened bamboo spears. The old man knows what's coming. Everyone knows what's coming. The only questions are when and how many will die. The scale of Operation Iceberg begins to take shape in late 1944 and early 1945. This won't be a raid or a quick seizure of strategic points. This is industrial-scale warfare, the application of America's crushing material superiority to the problem of conquering fortified Japanese territory. 4 Army divisions, 2 Marine divisions, 183,000 combat troops, more than landed at Normandy on D-Day. Supporting them will be the most powerful naval armada ever assembled: 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, 200 destroyers, and over 1,200 support vessels. The British Pacific Fleet, desperate to have a hand in Japan's defeat, commits 4 carriers and 2 battleships. The logistics alone stagger the imagination: 750,000 tons of supplies, 500,000 gallons of fuel per day, medical facilities to handle anticipated casualties that planners hope won't exceed their worst estimates. 183 days' worth of supplies are pre-positioned. Everything from bullets to bandages, from plasma to pontoon bridges. The photographic reconnaissance of Okinawa intensifies through March 1945. High-altitude cameras map every meter of coastline, every road, every village. Analysts study the images with magnifying glasses, counting gun emplacements, measuring beach gradients, identifying potential obstacles. What they see both encourages and disturbs them. The western beaches near Higuchi appear suitable for landing gentle slopes, few natural obstacles, good exits inland. But behind those beaches, the aerial photographs reveal something ominous. The southern third of the island, where the main Japanese defenses are clearly concentrated, consists of a nightmare landscape of ridges, ravines, and escarpments. Every hilltop bristles with fortifications. Every valley offers the defenders overlapping fields of fire. It's terrain that nullifies American advantages in armor and artillery, terrain where every 100 yards will cost blood. As March turns to April, the pieces move into position. At Ulithi Atoll, 1,400 miles southeast of Okinawa, the invasion fleet assembles in a display of naval power unprecedented in human history. Ships cover the lagoon from horizon to horizon. Sailors joke nervously that you could walk from one side of the atoll to the other by stepping from deck to deck without getting your feet wet. On Okinawa itself, Japanese defenders watch the skies, knowing reconnaissance planes mean invasion is imminent. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the 32nd Army, reviews his defensive plans one final time. His chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, has designed something radical, a defense in depth that abandons the beaches and invites Americans inland into a killing zone where Japanese advantages in terrain and defensive positions will offset American firepower. It's a calculated gamble that every defender will die, but die slowly, killing as many Americans as possible. On both sides of the Pacific, men who will soon try to kill each other make final preparations. They write last letters. They check equipment. They try not to think about the odds. And in Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt reviews casualty estimates for Okinawa, knowing that every number represents someone's son, and knowing that the alternative to taking Okinawa is even worse. The Keystone is about to be contested, and the price will be higher than anyone imagines. February 23, 1945, 100 feet beneath Okinawa's Shuri Castle, in a command bunker carved from solid limestone, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara spreads a map across a wooden table and prepares to argue against 2,000 years of Japanese military tradition. Around him sit the senior officers of the 32nd Army, men raised on samurai codes and stories of glorious charges, men who believe death in battle is the highest honor, men who are about to hear something that will strike many of them as cowardice. Yahara's finger traces the coastline. "We will not defend the beaches," he says quietly. The room erupts. An infantry regiment commander slams his fist on the table. "We must meet them at the water's edge. We must drive them into the sea." Yahara lets the anger wash over him, then continues in that same quiet voice. "And then we will die in the first 24 hours, and America will own Okinawa, and the homeland will have gained nothing. The silence that follows is deadly, because everyone in that room knows he's right." Traditional Japanese defensive doctrine, forged in victories across Asia, calls for aggressive counterattacks and decisive battles. Meet the enemy at his weakest point during the amphibious landing and annihilate him before he can establish a beachhead. This worked at Tarawa, at least partially, where Japanese defenders turned the lagoon red with marine blood. It worked at Peleliu, where American forces took devastating casualties in the first hours. But it hasn't stopped the American advance. Island after island, Japanese forces throw themselves at American landing forces in massive banzai charges, screaming warriors rushing machine guns with bayonets fixed. And, island after island, American firepower mows them down. By 1945, the tactical calculus is undeniable. Beach defenses and banzai charges result in rapid Japanese annihilation with minimal American casualties. Yahara has studied every battle report from Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. He's drawn uncomfortable conclusions. The old ways guarantee noble death but strategic failure. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Army, faces an impossible situation. Tokyo has given him 77,000 regular army troops and ordered him to delay the American invasion of Japan by at least 90 days. Not defeat it, delay it. The math is brutal. American intelligence estimates Japanese strength at 75,000. The actual number is close enough. Against him will come at least 150,000 American troops, backed by unlimited naval gunfire and complete air superiority. In every previous Pacific battle, American material superiority has been overwhelming. The Americans have so many ships they can afford to lose dozens to kamikazes. They have so much ammunition that preliminary bombardments fire more shells in a day than Japan manufactures in a month. They can evacuate their wounded to hospital ships where survival rates exceed 90%, while Japanese wounded die in caves without medicine. Ushijima knows he cannot win. But can he make the Americans pay such a horrific price that they lose their stomach for invading Japan proper? That's the question Yahara's plan addresses. The philosophy Yahara proposes represents a fundamental break with Japanese military culture. Instead of seeking glorious death in futile charges, Japanese forces will dig into Okinawa's mountainous southern region and force Americans into a meat grinder. No dramatic counterattacks. No heroic last stands on the beaches. Instead, a calculated war of attrition. Every ridge will be fortified. Every cave will become a strong point. Artillery will be positioned in reverse slope positions where American naval guns cannot reach them. Machine guns will be sighted to create interlocking fields of fire across every approach. And when Americans attack, Japanese soldiers will stay hidden, let the attackers get close, then open fire from concealed positions. When one position becomes untenable, defenders will retreat through tunnels to the next line. Kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier. Make every yard cost blood. String the battle out for months if possible. It's a plan that accepts Japanese annihilation as inevitable, but makes that destruction as expensive as possible for the enemy. It's strategic death, calibrated for maximum damage. The devil is in the details, and Yahara's staff has worked out those details with meticulous precision. Okinawa's geology offers unique advantages for this defensive philosophy. The southern third of the island consists of limestone riddled with natural caves. Japanese engineers have spent months expanding these caves, connecting them with hand-dug tunnels, creating an underground fortress. The main defensive line centers on Shuri Castle, the ancient capital of the Ryukyu Kingdom, sitting atop a commanding ridge system. From Shuri, 3 concentric defensive belts extend across the island. The Machinado Line in the north, the main Shuri Line in the center, the Yeju Dake Escarpment in the south. Each line consists of hundreds of fortified positions, pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, mortar pits pre-registered on every approach, artillery positions dug into hillsides with only the gun barrels visible. The defenders can move between positions through tunnels, safe from American bombardment. And behind it all, the caves, hundreds of them, some large enough to hold entire companies, all connected, all fortified, all stocked with ammunition and supplies. The implementation of this strategy requires discipline that seems almost inhuman. Japanese soldiers are ordered to dig and fortify rather than train for attacks. They're told to husband ammunition rather than expend it in suppressive fire. Most controversially, they're forbidden from conducting the nighttime banzai charges that have become synonymous with Japanese tactics. Younger officers protest vehemently. This is cowardice. This violates Bushido. The code of the warrior demands facing the enemy directly, dying with honor. Yahara's response is coldly logical. Honor means nothing if the homeland falls. Our honor lies in killing Americans, as many as possible, for as long as possible. If we die on the first day in glorious charges, we have failed our emperor. If we die on the 90th day after killing 10,000 Americans, we have served our emperor well. It's an argument that appeals to duty rather than glory, to cold strategy rather than hot blood. Slowly, reluctantly, the 32nd Army begins preparing for a different kind of battle. The human cost of this decision extends beyond military calculations. The 32nd Army faces a shortage of manpower, so Japanese authorities begin conscripting Okinawans. 20,000 local men, many of them farmers with no military training, are pressed into service as the Boeitai, or Home Guard. They receive minimal training and inferior weapons, often just rifles from the Russo-Japanese War, or hand grenades. Worse, Japanese authorities create the Blood and Iron Student Corps, conscripting boys aged 14 to 17 from Okinawa's schools. These children are told they will serve as messengers and scouts. In reality, many will be given explosives and told to crawl under American tanks. Okinawan women and girls are organized into nursing units, expected to care for Japanese wounded in battlefield conditions with no medical training. The message to Okinawans is clear. You will serve the emperor or be considered traitors. Your island is Japan's final defensive line. Your lives are expendable in service to the homeland. It's a brutality that many Okinawans will remember long after the war ends. The air dimension of Yahara's defensive strategy involves something even more radical than fortified lines: the systematic use of kamikaze aircraft. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding the 5th Air Fleet, has assembled 1,900 aircraft for Operation Tengo, the air campaign supporting Okinawa's defense. Most of these planes will fly one-way missions. The logic is grimly practical. Japanese pilot training has collapsed. Fuel is scarce. Experienced pilots are irreplaceable. But any pilot can crash a plane into a ship if he's willing to die. 10 massive kamikaze attacks, called Kikusui or floating chrysanthemum operations, are planned. Each wave will consist of hundreds of aircraft, all aimed at the American fleet supporting the invasion. If enough ships sink, the American ground forces will be cut off from supplies and naval gunfire support. It's a strategic gamble that acknowledges Japan's inability to defeat America in conventional combat. Instead, Japan will try to win through attrition and terror, making victory so costly that America sues for peace rather than continuing the bloodbath. The psychological preparation of Japanese defenders reflects this philosophy of calculated sacrifice. Unit commanders deliver speeches that mix traditional appeals to honor with stark realism about the situation. "We will not survive this battle," one regimental commander tells his troops. "Our bodies will fertilize Okinawa's soil. But before we die, we will kill so many Americans that their mothers will curse the day their government ordered an invasion of Japan. We will fight from our positions until ammunition is gone, then with bayonets, then with stones, then with our bare hands. Not because we seek death, but because our deaths must purchase time for the homeland." Soldiers write final letters to their families, knowing these will be their last words. Many compose death poems in the traditional manner, brief verses that express acceptance of fate. Yet underneath the traditional rituals, there's something new, a cold, calculated determination to die as expensively as possible, rather than as gloriously as possible. As March turns to April, Ushijima makes final inspections of his defenses. He walks through tunnels that extend for miles beneath the ridges. He observes artillery crews practicing fire missions from positions invisible to American reconnaissance. He watches infantry companies drilling on withdrawing through caves under simulated bombardment. Everything is as ready as it can be. Tokyo has sent no reinforcements, there are none to send. No aircraft will provide close air support. Japan's Air Force exists now only as kamikaze fodder. No ships will resupply the garrison. The Imperial Navy is finished as a fighting force. The 32nd Army stands alone, dug into an island 340 miles from the homeland, facing an enemy with infinite resources and total command of sea and air. Ushijima knows exactly how this ends, but Yahara's plan offers something that traditional tactics never could: time measured in American casualties. Time purchased with Japanese lives, spent efficiently rather than wastefully. On April 1st, the Americans will land. And they're going to discover that everything they learned about fighting Japanese forces in previous battles no longer applies. The philosophy of death has evolved. And it's going to make Okinawa the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. March 21st, 1945. A Navy photographer standing on the flight deck of USS Essex stares through his viewfinder at something that seems to defy physical reality. Ships. As far as the eye can see, in every direction, stretching to the horizon, ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels, landing craft. The entire lagoon at Ulithi Atoll, 20 square miles of protected water in the Caroline Islands, has become a forest of gray steel. The photographer tries to capture it in a single frame, but realizes immediately that no photograph can convey the scale. 1,400 ships, 1,400, carrying 183,000 combat troops, 390,000 support personnel, 750,000 tons of supplies. This is not merely an invasion fleet. This is American industrial might made manifest. This is what happens when the world's largest economy decides to end a war by drowning the enemy in steel and fire. The photographer clicks the shutter, knowing the image will never adequately capture what he's witnessing: the largest amphibious invasion force in Pacific War history, gathering for what many believe will be the last battle before Japan itself. The human story behind these numbers begins months earlier, across dozens of Pacific bases, as units receive orders for an operation code-named Iceberg. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, veterans of Guadalcanal and Peleliu, are pulled from rest areas in the Russell Islands and sent to prepare for another assault. The 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions, having fought through the Philippines, board transports knowing only that they're headed north. For many of these men, the war has already been longer than they can properly remember. They've island-hopped from Guadalcanal to Bougainville to Saipan to Iwo Jima. They've watched friends die on beaches whose names they couldn't pronounce. They've learned hard lessons about Japanese defensive tactics, about fighting an enemy who considers surrender worse than death, about the specific horror of flame-throwing caves and clearing bunkers with satchel charges. Now they're being told to prepare for the biggest operation yet. The whispered rumors get darker with each passing day. Bigger than Iwo, closer to Japan, the last one before we invade the mainland. The command structure for Operation Iceberg reflects the operation's unprecedented scale. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding the 10th Army, brings 2 corps under his control. The 24th Corps, 4 Army divisions under Major General John Hodge, the 3rd Amphibious Corps, 2 Marine divisions under Major General Roy Geiger. Supporting them is Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious force, and Admiral Raymond Spruance commanding the overall 5th Fleet. This is no thrown-together task force. This is the cream of America's Pacific command structure. Veterans all. Men who've learned their trade in the brutal school of island warfare. Buckner himself is an interesting choice son of Confederate General Simon Bolivar. Buckner Sr., a man raised on stories of Shiloh and the wilderness, now commanding American forces larger than any army his father ever saw. He's methodical, careful, skeptical of risks. These traits will become critically important, and controversially so, in the weeks ahead. The logistics of assembling and supplying this armada boggle the mind. At Ulithi, supply officers work around the clock, coordinating the loading of transport ships. Every item an army needs to function must be cataloged, packed, loaded in proper sequence for unloading. Ammunition comes first. Millions of rounds of small arms, tens of thousands of artillery shells, mortar rounds, grenades, rockets. Then, water in a tropical climate. Troops consume gallons per day, and Okinawa's water supplies may be contaminated or destroyed. Food for 183 days. Medical supplies sufficient for anticipated casualties that no one wants to state aloud. Spare parts for every vehicle and weapon system. Construction equipment to build airfields. Pontoon bridging sections. Flamethrowers and napalm. Even mail facilities, because troop morale depends on letters from home. The supply ships alone number over 400 vessels. One transport captain jokes grimly that they're carrying enough supplies to invade a continent. He doesn't know how right he is, the stockpile being assembled for Operation Iceberg rivals what was shipped to Normandy for D-Day. The naval component of the invasion force represents American naval dominance in its purest form. 40 aircraft carriers, fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers capable of putting over 1,000 aircraft into the sky simultaneously. 18 battleships, including veterans of Pearl Harbor like USS West Virginia and USS Tennessee, now modernized and hungry for revenge. 200 destroyers to screen the fleet and provide close-in fire support. British Pacific Fleet Task Force 57 adds 4 more carriers and 2 battleships, the first time British forces have operated under American command in the Pacific. The total tonnage of this fleet exceeds the combined naval strength of most nations. More importantly, it represents a level of air and naval gunfire support that should, in theory, obliterate any defensive position before American troops come within rifle range. The pre-invasion bombardment plan calls for battleships to fire as many shells into Okinawa in a week as they would have fired in an entire pre-war year. Every bunker, every gun position, every suspected strong point will be hammered by naval artillery. That's the theory. The human faces behind this massive operation emerge in thousands of small moments. Private Eugene Sledge, 5th Marine Regiment, records his thoughts in a journal he keeps despite regulations against it. He's already survived the horror of Peleliu, where heat and coral and Japanese defenders turned several square miles into hell. Now, at age 21, he's preparing for something larger. His entries mix dark humor with barely suppressed terror. They tell us Okinawa will be easier than Peleliu. They told us Peleliu would be a 3-day operation. Nobody believes anything they tell us anymore. In another transport, an army sergeant from Kansas writes his wife, without mentioning where he's going, censors would black it out anyway. He tells her about the poker games, the rumors, the way men get quiet at night thinking about what's coming. He doesn't tell her about the nightmares, or the way his hands shake when he thinks about hitting another beach, or how many of his friends from training are already dead. The ethnic composition of this invasion force reflects both America's diversity and its contradictions. Nisei soldiers, second-generation Japanese Americans, serve as translators and intelligence specialists, despite the fact that their families are in internment camps back home. The Navajo code talkers, whose language provided unbreakable radio encryption in previous battles, are embedded with Marine units. African American units serve in segregated logistics and anti-aircraft battalions, fighting a war for democracy in a military that doesn't treat them as equals. Puerto Rican soldiers, who constitute disproportionate numbers in several infantry regiments, prepare for an assault on an island whose people share their status as colonial subjects. The American military of 1945 is a complicated instrument, powerful but prejudiced, united in purpose but divided by law and custom. All these contradictions will be shipped to Okinawa together, where death at least is indiscriminate. The preparation phase includes elements that speak to both technological sophistication and brutal improvisation. Naval construction battalions, the Seabees, train in mock-ups of Japanese fortifications, learning how to rapidly build airfields under fire. Special underwater demolition teams practice clearing beach obstacles, knowing their casualty rates are often the highest of any unit. Marine and Army units conduct rehearsal landings on islands far from Okinawa, practicing coordination between tanks, infantry, and naval gunfire. New weapons are distributed and training conducted. The M4 Sherman tank, upgunned with a 75mm cannon, flamethrower tanks, armored amphibious vehicles capable of crossing coral reefs. Every lesson from previous battles gets incorporated. Every failure gets addressed. At least, that's the goal. But no amount of training can truly prepare men for what they're about to face. Because the Japanese are preparing too, and they're preparing something different. As the fleet prepares to depart Ulithi, a subtle shift in mood becomes noticeable. The usual pre-invasion bravado seems muted. Men who've survived multiple campaigns have developed an instinct for danger, and something about this operation feels different. Partly, it's the scale everyone can see they're part of something unprecedented. Partly, it's the rumors filtering down about Iwo Jima, which ended just weeks earlier with horrific casualties for such a small island. If a volcanic rock 8 square miles in size costs 7,000 American lives, what will an island 60 miles long cost? The mathematics don't favor optimism. More than that, there's a psychological weight to approaching Japan proper. Every previous battle has been on islands most Americans had never heard of. Okinawa is part of the Japanese prefecture system. It's closer to Tokyo than Hawaii is to California. Landing there means the war has entered its final phase, and final phases of wars are when desperation turns to savagery. The departure from Ulithi begins on March 27th. It takes days for the fleet to sortie. You cannot move 1,400 ships simultaneously without risking collision or chaos. They leave in groups, forming up at sea, eventually creating a procession that stretches for miles. Sailors on the escorting destroyers watch in awe as the enormous formation takes shape. Capital ships surrounded by screening vessels, transports protected by carriers, submarines prowling ahead to scout for Japanese forces. The fleet moves north at a steady clip, crossing the Pacific toward Okinawa, toward the greatest battle most of these men will ever experience. Behind them, Ulithi's lagoon sits empty for the first time in months. Ahead, 340 miles from the Japanese homeland, an island waits. Its defenders have been preparing for months. They've dug into the mountains. They've fortified every approach. They've accepted death as inevitable but chosen to die expensively. And in 72 hours, American forces are going to discover just how expensively. The Armada sails north. Every man aboard knows this is the final act. What none of them know is how long that act will take, or how much it will cost before the curtain finally falls. April 1st, 1945, 8:23 A. Staff Sergeant James Day, 1st Battalion, 22nd Marines, crouches in the well of an Amtrak, an amphibious tractor, as it churns through moderately choppy seas toward Okinawa's Hagushi beaches. The engine's roar drowns out everything except the naval bombardment thundering overhead. He's done this twice before, hit a beach under fire, and both times were nightmares of blood and chaos. At Tarawa, machine guns turned the lagoon red before Marines even reached shore. At Saipan, Japanese artillery opened up the moment the ramp dropped. Day grips his rifle and runs through the mental checklist every assault trooper develops. Stay low when the ramp drops. Move fast off the beach. Find cover. Return fire. He expects to be in a firefight within 30 seconds of landing. Every man in the Amtrak expects the same thing. The previous night, a chaplain held services for the battalion. Attendance was nearly 100%. Nobody sleeps before an amphibious assault. You just wait for dawn and wonder if you'll live through the day. The ramp drops at precisely 8:30 a.m. Day charges out, rifle ready, adrenaline flooding his system, and finds himself running across an empty beach. No machine gun fire, no artillery, no Japanese soldiers. For a few seconds, his brain cannot process what his eyes are showing him. He's alone on a Pacific beach during an invasion, and nobody is shooting at him. Other Marines are spreading out, moving cautiously inland, weapons raised, expecting ambush at any moment. But the ambush doesn't come. They pass through abandoned defensive positions, trenches dug but unmanned, firing slits cut into concrete bunkers, but the bunkers empty. 100 yards inland, Day stops and looks around in complete confusion. Behind him, more Amtraks are beaching, disgorging Marines who spread out in textbook fashion, preparing for resistance that isn't materializing. Above, carrier aircraft circle, looking for targets that don't exist. The massive naval bombardment, which has been pulverizing the beaches for hours, has been firing at ghosts. The surreal nature of L-Day becomes more pronounced with every passing hour. By 10 a.m., both Marine divisions have secured the landing beaches and pushed inland against only scattered resistance. Marines who expected to spend the day fighting for survival find themselves walking upright, smoking cigarettes, joking nervously about the lack of opposition. Some men, veterans of previous landings, are openly suspicious this has to be a trap. The Japanese must be waiting inland, ready to spring an ambush. But as the morning progresses and resistance remains minimal, confusion gives way to cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, this one won't be so bad. Maybe the massive pre-invasion bombardment actually worked. Maybe the Japanese garrison is smaller than intelligence estimated. By noon, American forces have secured both Yontan and Kadena airfields, the primary objectives for the entire first phase. Combat engineers inspect the runways and find them largely intact. Casualties for the morning? 28 killed, 104 wounded, against 60,000 troops landed. It's unprecedented. It's almost unbelievable. Behind the beaches, the logistical avalanche begins. Supply ships move to offshore anchorages and begin unloading. Landing craft ferry supplies ashore in an endless procession. By afternoon, Hagushi Beach resembles a massive construction site more than a battlefield. Bulldozers carve roads inland. Supply dumps grow like mushrooms. Artillery batteries set up and register their guns, though there's little to shoot at. Medical personnel, who prepared for mass casualties, find themselves with almost nothing to do. The whole invasion has a strange, dreamlike quality, as if everyone involved is waiting for the other shoe to drop. Staff officers study maps and intelligence reports, trying to understand the Japanese plan. Where are they? The aerial reconnaissance clearly showed defensive preparations. The garrison is estimated at 75,000 troops. You don't make that many soldiers disappear. They're somewhere. But where? The explanation, of course, lies in Colonel Yahara's defensive strategy. From his command post 100 feet beneath Shuri Castle, he watches the invasion through observer reports with cold satisfaction. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. American forces are landing unopposed, walking into the trap, concentrating their forces on the beaches where they're most vulnerable to artillery fire when that artillery finally opens up. But not yet. Not until the Americans push further inland, until their supply lines stretch thin, until they're committed beyond the point of easy withdrawal. The 32nd Army's main defensive line sits miles inland, dug into the ridges and escarpments of southern Okinawa. The beaches? Worthless. Let the Americans have them. Let them congratulate themselves on their easy landing. Let them grow confident. And then, when they push south into the real defenses, teach them that everything they learned in previous battles no longer applies. The philosophy of death demands patience, and Yahara is patient. The dichotomy between northern and southern Okinawa begins to manifest almost immediately. Marine forces, landing on the western beaches, have two objectives: secure the airfields, accomplished by noon on L-Day, and then push north to clear the Motobu Peninsula. That northern region, they soon discover, is lightly defended. Small Japanese units conduct fighting retreats, delaying but not stopping the Marine advance. It's a sideshow, and both sides know it. The real battle lies to the south, where Army divisions will push toward the main Japanese defensive lines. On L-Day afternoon, the Army's 24th Corps begins probing southward, and for the first time, they encounter real resistance. Not overwhelming, not catastrophic, but enough to indicate that something different waits ahead. Patrols encounter prepared positions. Artillery fire begins falling with uncomfortable accuracy. Scouts report seeing fortified ridges in the distance. The mood shifts. This, the veterans realize, is what they were expecting all along. The easy morning was an aberration. Reality is reasserting itself. Individual experiences on L-Day reveal the psychological complexity of combat. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, landing with the 5th Marines, describes a profound sense of anticlimax, mixed with dread. After the horror of Peleliu, where the beach was swept with fire before his Amtrak even touched land, the unopposed Okinawa landing feels wrong, too easy, too quiet. He writes later that it felt like walking into a haunted house, knowing something terrible waits around every corner, but not knowing where or when it will appear. Other Marines express similar sentiments: relief at surviving the landing, but a bone-deep certainty that the Japanese haven't suddenly decided to give up. They're out there, somewhere, waiting. For the moment, the Americans are walking upright and digging foxholes without being shot at. But everyone knows it can't last. The only questions are when and where the hammer will fall. The operational contrast between American expectations and Japanese reality could not be more stark. American planning assumed the beaches would be contested with typical Japanese ferocity. The massive pre-invasion bombardment was designed to suppress beach defenses. The combat loading of transports prioritized getting infantry ashore quickly to exploit gaps in defensive lines. Medical units prepared for the kind of mass casualties seen at Tarawa and Iwo Jima. None of that proved necessary. The Japanese simply weren't defending the beaches. But this creates its own problems. American forces are now ashore in massive numbers, with supplies piling up on beaches that remain within range of Japanese artillery positioned in the hills. The logistics tail, the vulnerable supply chain, stretches from ship to shore to inland dumps, all potentially exposed to attack. If the Japanese have withdrawn to prepared positions inland, they've actually improved their situation. Instead of being hit by naval gunfire on the beaches, they're now forcing Americans to attack them in terrain of their choosing. The mood in American command posts on the evening of April 1st is cautiously optimistic but puzzled. 10th Army Headquarters reviews casualty reports with something approaching disbelief. Fewer than 30 killed on L-Day? When tens of thousands were landed? Admiral Turner calls it the most successful landing in the Pacific War. General Buckner is more circumspect. He's studied intelligence reports. He knows roughly where the Japanese defensive lines are, and he knows that the easy part is over. Tomorrow, American forces will push inland in force. Tomorrow, they'll encounter the real defenses. Tonight, for just one night, troops can sleep without being under immediate threat, but even that sleep is uneasy. Because every veteran knows that when something seems too good to be true in combat, it usually is. The Japanese gave away the beaches without a fight. Nothing in 3 years of Pacific warfare suggests they've lost their will to fight, which means they're preparing something worse, something different. April Fool's Day, it turns out, is an appropriate name, because the joke is on everyone who thinks this battle is going to be easy. The Japanese have given the Americans exactly what Yahara planned to give them false confidence, and starting tomorrow, they'll begin extracting payment. April 3rd, 1945, 0600 hours. The Motobu Peninsula, northern Okinawa. Captain Louis Gargano, 4th Marines, leads his company up a steep, jungle-covered ridge, moving through terrain that seems designed to frustrate military operations. The peninsula is all mountains and ravines, covered in dense subtropical forest that reduces visibility to yards. It's guerrilla country, perfect for ambush and hiding. Gargano's Marines advance carefully, weapons ready, expecting contact at any moment. They're not disappointed. A sudden burst of machine gun fire from a cave 60 yards upslope. Marines hit the dirt, return fire, call for a flamethrower team, standard Pacific War tactics. Within 30 minutes, the cave is cleared, a dozen Japanese bodies inside, and the company moves forward. It's hard fighting, but it's recognizable fighting. Small unit actions, clearing positions, advancing methodically. By nightfall, the company has advanced half a mile and taken a dozen casualties. Gargano writes in his log that at this rate, northern Okinawa will be secured in 3 weeks. He's roughly correct. And 300 miles to the south, a completely different battle is beginning. The same day, same hour, southern Okinawa. Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Maybury, 381st Infantry Regiment, 96th Division, watches through binoculars as his battalion prepares to assault a ridge system that Army intelligence has designated Cactus Ridge. It's part of the outer defenses of the Japanese Makinado Line, the first layer of fortifications protecting the southern approaches to Shuri. From Maybury's position, Cactus Ridge looks like hell, sculpted in coral, steep slopes, bare of vegetation, pockmarked with cave entrances and pillboxes. Artillery has been pounding it for hours. Naval gunfire has walked back and forth across it. And still, Maybury can see movement up there, flickers of activity that suggest the defenders are very much alive. At 0700 hours, the battalion advances, and immediately the ridge comes alive with fire. Machine guns from mutually supporting positions, mortar rounds dropping with uncanny accuracy. Artillery from positions further back that seem immune to counter battery fire. Within minutes, the advance stalls. Within an hour, casualties mount into the dozens. By day's end, the 381st Infantry has advanced exactly 200 yards and lost 43 men killed and over 100 wounded. Northern Okinawa is turning into a manageable problem. Southern Okinawa is revealing itself as something completely different. The bifurcation of the Okinawa campaign into 2 separate battles stems from both geography and Japanese strategy. The Ishikawa Isthmus, a narrow waste of land 2 miles wide, effectively divides Okinawa into distinct zones. North of the isthmus lies the Motobu Peninsula, and surrounding terrain, heavily forested, mountainous, lightly defended. Colonel Takedo Udo commands perhaps 2,000 Japanese troops in this region, mainly guerrilla units, with orders to delay but not decisively engage. Udo knows his mission is hopeless from the start. Yahara's defensive plan writes off northern Okinawa as indefensible. The terrain favors defenders tactically, but offers no strategic depth. American mobility and firepower will overwhelm any fixed defenses. So Udo's forces conduct a fighting retreat, making the Marines pay for every ridge and valley, but never committing to a suicidal last stand. It's smart, economical warfare, but it's the sideshow. South of the isthmus, everything changes. The terrain shifts from jungle mountains to terraced farmland and coral ridges. More importantly, this is where Yahara has positioned the main Japanese defensive lines. The outer Makinado line runs east-west across the island, anchored on fortified positions at Kakazu Ridge, Kakazu West, and other carefully chosen terrain features. Behind it, the main shoreline surrounds the ancient Ryukyu capital, taking advantage of natural escarpments and centuries-old castle walls. And further south, a final line protects the Kien Peninsula. 75,000 Japanese troops are concentrated in this 30-square-mile area. They've had months to prepare. Every ridge has been turned into a fortress. Every approach is covered by interlocking fire. And unlike in the north, these defenders have orders to hold to the death. No retreats, no withdrawals. Every position will be fought for until the last defender is killed. This is where Yahara plans to bleed the Americans white. The American command structure inadvertently reinforces this division. General Geiger's 3rd Amphibious Corps, consisting of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, is tasked with clearing northern Okinawa. General Hodge's 24th Corps, 4 Army divisions, is responsible for the southern drive. Different commanders, different objectives, different tactical situations. The Marines in the north are conducting mobile warfare, advancing several miles per day, engaging in small unit actions that pit squad against squad. They take casualties, but the battle moves at a pace that keeps morale relatively high. The army in the south finds itself in something that increasingly resembles World War I trench warfare. Frontal assaults against prepared positions, artillery duels, grinding attrition measured in hundreds of yards per week, and casualties that quickly surpass anything the Marines in the north are experiencing. April 9th marks the first serious collision between American forces and Japanese main defenses. The 96th Division, pushing south from the Cactus Ridge area, encounters Kakuzu Ridge, a key position in the outer Machinado line. On paper, Kakuzu is unremarkable, an escarpment roughly 1,000 yards long, rising about 100 feet above the surrounding terrain. In reality, it's a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Japanese defenders have carved the ridge into a honeycomb of firing positions, tunnels, and command posts. Artillery observers on the reverse slope can call down fire on any approach without exposing themselves. Machine gun nests are positioned to sweep every avenue of attack, and the coral itself, hard as granite, provides protection that sandbags could never match. The 96th Division's first assault on Kakuzu Ridge on April 9th ends in bloody failure. Troops reach the base of the ridge, begin climbing under fire, and are driven back by a combination of machine gun fire and precisely timed artillery strikes. Casualties: over 100 men for 0 territorial gain. It's the first indication of what southern Okinawa is going to cost. Meanwhile, in the north, the Marines are making steady progress. April 13th, the 6th Marine Division launches a coordinated assault on Mount Yaitake, the highest point on Motobu Peninsula and the center of Udo's defensive position. It's tough fighting. Udo's guerrillas are skilled, brave, and fighting from excellent positions. But the Marines have flamethrowers, demolitions, close air support, and most importantly, room to maneuver. By April 16, Mount Yaitake falls. By April 20, organized resistance in northern Okinawa effectively ends. Marine casualties for the entire northern campaign: 236 killed, about 1,000 wounded. It's considered a success. Southern Okinawa, in the same time frame, has cost the army over 1,500 killed and 5,000 wounded, and they've barely penetrated the outer defensive line. The contrast is stunning and demoralizing. Half the island secured in 3 weeks with moderate casualties, the other half barely dented despite horrific losses. The psychological impact on the troops experiencing these different battles cannot be overstated. Marines in the north, while acknowledging their fight was difficult, returned to southern Okinawa to find army units that look shell-shocked. 1,000-yard stares, troops jumping at loud noises. Entire companies reduced to half strength. The Marines fought an enemy they could see and maneuver against. The army is fighting an enemy that's largely invisible, emerging from caves to fire a few shots, then disappearing before artillery can respond. More demoralizing still is the nature of the casualties. In mobile warfare, you can at least feel like you're accomplishing something. You take a hill, you've taken a hill. In the south, units assault the same ridge 3 days in a row, lose men each time. and the ridge remains in Japanese hands. It's corrosive to morale in ways that conventional combat isn't. The terrain itself becomes an enemy equal to the Japanese. Southern Okinawa's ridges are composed of coral limestone, a peculiar rock that's simultaneously hard and brittle. Shells explode against it, sending razor-sharp shrapnel in all directions. It's nearly impossible to dig proper foxholes. The coral defeats entrenching tools, so troops pile rocks into low walls that provide inadequate protection. The ridges have vertical or near-vertical faces, meaning attackers must often climb exposed cliff faces under fire. And the cave systems are unlike anything American forces have encountered before. Not simple holes, but extensive tunnel networks where Japanese troops can retreat when one area comes under attack, then emerge elsewhere. Flamethrowing a cave entrance doesn't clear the cave, it just forces defenders deeper into tunnels that connect to other positions. The disparity between North and South also reveals limitations in American tactical doctrine. The Marines' mobile, aggressive tactics work well in the North because the terrain and enemy situation favor mobility. The Army's approach in the South, methodical, artillery-heavy, relying on firepower to suppress defenses, proves inadequate against an enemy that lives underground and emerges only briefly to fire. American advantages in tanks, artillery, and close air support mean less when the enemy is literally inside mountains. You cannot shell someone who's in a tunnel 100 feet underground. You cannot strafe positions you cannot see. And tanks, however useful for direct fire support, cannot climb vertical coral faces. The Americans are learning, painfully, that they're fighting a different kind of war in the South, and the lessons are written in blood. By the end of April, the Okinawa campaign has stratified into distinct phases and zones. The Northern Operation, complete. Southern Operation, barely begun, casualties mounting, no breakthrough in sight. The initial optimism from the easy April 1st landing has evaporated completely. Intelligence officers revise estimates of Japanese strength upward. Clearly there are more defenders than initially thought, and they're better positioned and more determined than previous engagements suggested. Medical facilities, which were overwhelmed by the light L-Day casualties, are now operating beyond capacity. Hospital ships shuttle wounded back to rear area facilities. The psychiatric casualties, combat, fatigue, shell shock, battle neurosis, whatever term you prefer, are appearing at rates that alarm medical personnel. And the battle has only just begun. The Machinado line hasn't been broken, the Shuri line hasn't even been seriously tested. And nobody in American command has any idea how to break the stalemate without simply feeding more troops into the meat grinder. 2 islands, 1 campaign, 2 radically different battles. And the hard one is about to get much, much harder. April 19th, 1945, 05:30 hours. Private Robert Sherrod, 7th Infantry Division, hasn't slept in 48 hours. He's crouched in a shallow depression scraped from coral at the base of Kakazu Ridge, watching the pre-dawn sky lighten over southern Okinawa. In 30 minutes, his battalion will attack the ridge again, the 3rd attempt in 4 days. Around him, other soldiers check weapons with mechanical precision, faces blank with exhaustion. Nobody talks. There's nothing left to say. They all know what's about to happen. They'll advance toward the ridge, under covering fire from artillery and mortars. They'll reach the base, maybe climb partway up. Japanese machine guns will open fire from positions that weren't there yesterday, or at least weren't visible yesterday. Mortars will drop with uncanny accuracy. Men will fall. The advance will stall. They'll withdraw, leaving their dead where they fell, because retrieving bodies under fire costs more lives. Tomorrow they'll do it again. This is what the Okinawa campaign has become. This is the meat grinder. The battle for Kakazu Ridge exemplifies everything that makes southern Okinawa a nightmare. The ridge itself runs roughly east-west for about 1,000 yards, rising approximately 100 feet above surrounding terrain. It doesn't sound impressive described that way. 100 feet is a 10-story building, but Kakazu's slopes are near vertical in places, composed of coral that offers no handholds, no natural cover. Japanese defenders have spent months fortifying every meter. Caves connect to tunnels that connect to other caves. Machine gun positions are sited with interlocking fields of fire. You cannot advance on one without exposing yourself to another. Artillery observers sit on the reverse slope, invisible to American forces but able to call fire down on every approach. Snipers hide in crevices, picking off officers and radio men. And the defenders follow Yahara's doctrine religiously. They don't counterattack, don't waste ammunition on suppressive fire, don't reveal positions until attackers are committed and exposed. They simply wait, let Americans climb toward them, then open fire at point-blank range. The first major assault on Kakuzu Ridge, April 19th, involves 2 battalions of the 383rd Infantry Regiment, supported by armor from the 716th Tank Battalion. The plan is straightforward. Artillery preparation, tanks providing direct fire support, infantry advancing under that umbrella to seize the ridge. It's textbook combined arms warfare, the kind of operation American forces have executed successfully dozens of times in Europe and the Pacific. It fails completely. The artillery preparation pounds the ridge, but affects defenders in deep caves, not at all. The tanks advance, but cannot climb the coral faces, leaving them exposed on flat ground where Japanese artillery, positioned miles away, in positions Americans haven't even located, destroys 3 tanks in minutes. The infantry reaches the base of the ridge, begins climbing, and walks into a hurricane of fire. Machine guns from positions that weren't hit by artillery. Knee mortars dropping rounds with devastating accuracy. Grenades rolled down the slopes. Within hours, the attack collapses. Casualties: 720 men killed or wounded. Territorial gain: 0. The pattern repeats with soul-crushing regularity through late April. April 21st, another assault on Kakuzu. Another failure. April 23rd, a coordinated attack across the entire Okinawa line. Minimal gains at catastrophic cost. The 96th Division, which landed on Okinawa with full strength, is hemorrhaging personnel at rates that would have destroyed divisions in previous wars. Rifle companies that should number 190 men are operating with half that. Platoons are led by sergeants because all the officers are casualties. Experienced men, veterans of the Philippines campaign, are being killed or wounded faster than replacements can arrive. And the replacements, fresh from training, often die within days of arriving at the front. The institutional knowledge that keeps units alive, which positions offer cover, where the Japanese firing points are, how to coordinate movement under fire, evaporates as casualties mount. The nature of the combat creates psychological damage in ways that conventional warfare does not. In a normal battle, you can see the enemy, shoot back, feel like you're accomplishing something. At Kakuzu and the other ridges defending the Machinado line, the enemy is largely invisible until the moment he kills you. Troops describe the eerie sensation of advancing through what appears to be empty terrain, then suddenly being engulfed in fire from every direction. Soldiers develop acute paranoia about caves. Every hole in the coral might contain Japanese defenders, might conceal a machine gun, might be the last thing you see. The American advantage in artillery becomes almost meaningless because you cannot shell an enemy, you cannot locate, and Japanese positions are so well camouflaged that air observers fly over ridges and report no military activity while hundreds of troops shelter in tunnels below. The weapons that prove most effective tell their own story about the nature of this combat. Flamethrowers become the infantry's most valued tool. Despite being horrifically dangerous to operate, fuel tanks make you a priority target, and the weapons have limited range. But a flamethrower can reach into caves and tunnels where bullets cannot. Explosives become standard equipment. Satchel charges, pole charges, demolitions of every kind. When you cannot shoot an enemy out of a position, sometimes you can blow the position up. The problem is delivering those explosives under fire, which turns demolition men into the highest casualty specialists. Tank-mounted flamethrowers, nicknamed Zippos, provide mobile firepower that can suppress cave entrances long enough for infantry to advance. But tanks remain vulnerable to Japanese artillery and the terrain limits where they can operate. The human cost of this fighting reveals itself in the medical statistics. The 96th Division alone suffers 7,374 casualties between April 1st and May 7th. That's more than half the division's effective strength. The 7th Division, attacking further east, loses similar numbers. Casualty rates in rifle companies, the troops doing actual fighting, approach 70% in some units. Medical personnel work around the clock in aid stations, set up in captured Japanese bunkers, tending to wounds that 19th century surgeons would recognize. Shrapnel injuries, traumatic amputations, sucking chest wounds, burns from flamethrowers that backfire, or Japanese defenders who fight back with gasoline bombs. The plasma supply runs critically low. Morphine syrettes, marked with an M, on the forehead of wounded who receive doses to prevent overdose, become ubiquitous symbols of Okinawa. And increasingly, the psychiatric casualties mount men who haven't been physically wounded, but who simply cannot function anymore, who shake uncontrollably, or stare into space, or burst into tears without apparent cause. The tactical innovation that emerges from this crucible involves what's called blowtorch and corkscrew tactics. Infantry, tanks, and engineers work in close coordination. Tanks approach a cave or pillbox, suppressing it with machine gun fire. Flamethrower teams move up under that cover and burn out the opening. Engineers move in with demolitions to seal the cave or blow it open, depending on the situation. Infantry provides security, preventing Japanese troops from emerging from adjacent positions to counterattack. It's methodical, dangerous, and slow. A single cave can take hours to clear. A ridge system with dozens of caves can consume days. But it works, in the sense that it allows forward progress where frontal assaults fail. The problem is the human cost. Every action requires troops to expose themselves to fire from positions they haven't cleared yet. And the Japanese, following Yahara's doctrine, make every meter expensive. The contrast with other World War II battles is striking and depressing. In Europe, armored breakthroughs and mobile warfare allow rapid advances. In previous Pacific battles, overwhelming firepower and aggressive assaults eventually break Japanese defenses even at high cost. Okinawa is different. The terrain negates mobility. The defensive positions are too strong for frontal assault. American material superiority matters less when the enemy lives underground. By the end of April, a grim realization settles over American commanders. There is no clever solution to the Okinawa problem. There's only brutal, methodical reduction of fortified positions, one by one, at whatever cost is necessary. The meat grinder will continue grinding. The only question is how long it takes and how high the butcher's bill will be. The psychological toll on attackers manifests in ways both obvious and subtle. Obvious: the increasing numbers of men evacuated for combat fatigue, the 1,000-yard stares, the way veterans flinch at sudden noises. Subtle: the way humor becomes darker, how soldiers stop learning the names of replacements because replacements die so quickly, how men stop thinking about the future because there might not be a future. Letters home become shorter, vaguer. Men stop making plans. You don't think about what you'll do after the war when you're not sure you'll survive today. The Okinawa campaign is only a month old, and already it's breaking men in ways that concern officers and medical personnel. The human spirit is not infinitely resilient. Break it badly enough, and it doesn't recover. And southern Okinawa in April 1945 is a machine designed to break spirits. The month ends with the Machinado line still intact, American casualties approaching 15,000, and no breakthrough in sight. General Buckner reviews the situation and makes a decision that will haunt him: continue the frontal assault. There are alternatives. Marine commanders suggest amphibious end runs, landing behind Japanese lines to force a withdrawal. Buckner rejects these proposals, citing concerns about logistics and exposing the landing force to kamikaze attacks. His decision means the meat grinder will continue. Infantry will continue assaulting fortified ridges. The casualty lists will continue growing, and the Japanese, dug into their mountain fortress, will continue making the Americans pay in blood for every yard. April has been the bloodiest month of the campaign. May will be worse, because ahead lies not the outer Machinado line, but the main Shuri line, where Ushijima has concentrated his best troops in positions even stronger than Kakuzu. The meat grinder is just warming up, and everyone knows it. April 6th, 1945, 1,400 hours. Radar operator second class Joseph Landers stands watch in the cramped Combat Information Center of USS Bush, a destroyer on picket station 15 miles north of Okinawa. He's been staring at the radar scope for 3 hours, watching the endless procession of friendly aircraft returning to their carriers. Then something changes. Multiple contacts, bearing 350 degrees, range 40 miles, closing fast. Landers keys his microphone. Raid inbound, bearing 350, count 30 plus bandits. The response is immediate general quarters sounds throughout the ship. A klaxon that sends men running to battle stations. Within 90 seconds, Bush is ready for action. 5-inch guns trained skyward. 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns manned. Damage control parties standing by. Landers watches the radar contacts close. 30 miles, 20, 15. Then, through the bridge windows, he sees them. Aircraft. Dozens of aircraft. Coming directly at the ship in a way no rational pilot would fly, because these pilots don't intend to return. They're kamikazes, and Bush is in their path. The kamikaze divine wind represents Japan's strategic desperation made manifest. By April 1945, conventional Japanese naval aviation has effectively ceased to exist. Pilot training has collapsed under fuel shortages and lack of experienced instructors. Aircraft carriers sit in ports, either damaged beyond repair or without pilots to fly their planes. The Zero fighter, once the pride of Japanese aviation, is obsolete against newer American aircraft like the Hellcat and Corsair. In conventional combat, Japanese pilots are slaughtered. A trained American pilot in a superior aircraft will down a Japanese pilot 9 times out of 10. But Vice Admiral Matomi Ugaki, commanding what remains of Japanese naval aviation, has realized something. You don't need a trained pilot to crash a plane into a ship. You need just enough training to fly and navigate, and you need pilots willing to die. Japan has plenty of those. Operation Kikusui Floating Chrysanthemum is the code name for 10 massive kamikaze attacks planned to support Okinawa's defense. Each attack will involve hundreds of aircraft, all on one-way missions, all aimed at the American fleet. The strategic logic is brutal and simple. The American ground offensive depends absolutely on naval support. Ships provide fire support that can reach miles inland. They deliver supplies, they evacuate wounded, sink enough ships, and the ground offensive stalls, make the naval casualties high enough, and perhaps America loses its will to continue. It's a strategy born of desperation, but desperation doesn't make it ineffective. The first Kikusui attack, April 6th and 7th, involves 355 kamikaze aircraft, plus several hundred conventional fighters and bombers to provide cover and distraction. They're aimed primarily at the radar picket destroyers stationed around Okinawa to provide early warning. Ships like Bush. The physics of kamikaze attacks work disturbingly well. A typical dive bomber or torpedo plane needs to approach carefully, line up its attack, release its weapon, and escape. This gives defending ships time to maneuver, time for anti-aircraft fire to disrupt the attack. A kamikaze pilot eliminates all those steps. He just flies directly at the ship and crashes into it. Anti-aircraft fire might damage the plane, might even kill the pilot, but as long as the aircraft remains somewhat intact and on course, the attack continues. A 500-pound bomb-laden aircraft hitting a ship at 300 miles per hour delivers devastating kinetic and explosive energy. Against capital ships, carriers, battleships, kamikazes often cause damage but rarely sink the vessel. Against destroyers, with their thin armor and small size, a single kamikaze hit can be catastrophic. And the psychological impact of being deliberately targeted for death by a human being adds a dimension of horror absent in conventional attacks. USS Bush and USS Colhoun, operating together on Picket Station 1, become the focus of the April 6th kamikaze assault. Over the course of 90 minutes, approximately 25 kamikazes attack these two ships. Bush's 5-inch guns open fire at maximum range, throwing up a wall of exploding shells. The 40mm batteries join in at medium range. Finally, the 20mm guns engage point blank. Planes disintegrate in mid-air. Wings shear off. Pilots slump dead in their cockpits from anti-aircraft fire. But they keep coming. The first kamikaze to hit Bush strikes amidships, penetrating to the engine room and exploding. The ship loses power. Dead in the water, Bush becomes an easy target. A second kamikaze hits moments later. Then a third. Colquhoun, maneuvering desperately, is hit twice. Both ships are burning, listing, their crews fighting for survival rather than fighting the enemy. By 1600 hours, both destroyers are abandoned and sinking. Combined casualties, over 100 sailors dead. The scope of the kamikaze threat reveals itself over the following days and weeks. April 7th, another wave of kamikazes, sinking the destroyer USS Hancock. April 12, kamikazes severely damage the carrier USS Enterprise and sink 2 destroyers. April 16, the destroyer USS Laffey earns immortality by surviving 22 separate kamikaze attacks in 80 minutes. Her gunners shoot down most of the attackers, but 6 aircraft crash into the ship. Laffey should sink, her hull is torn open, fires rage, casualties exceed 40% of the crew. She doesn't sink. Damage control parties work miracles, and the ship limps back to base under her own power. But Laffey is an exception. Most ships hit by multiple kamikazes go down or are damaged beyond repair. The human stories behind the kamikaze attacks reveal the tragedy on both sides. Japanese pilots, many of them university students with minimal flight training, write final letters to their families before taking off on one-way missions. They know exactly what they're doing: no fuel for return, no parachutes, no possibility of survival. Some letters express genuine devotion to the emperor and belief in Japan's cause. Others reveal young men terrified of death but unable to refuse orders without dishonoring their families. One pilot, 19 years old, writes to his mother, "I do not wish to die, but I cannot let my comrades go alone. Please forgive me for dying before you." He takes off at dawn and crashes his Zero into a destroyer 3 hours later. On the American side, sailors describe the horror of watching a plane come directly at your ship, knowing the pilot intends to die, killing you. Anti-aircraft gunners fire until their barrels overheat, watching planes disintegrate but keep coming, carried forward by momentum even after the pilot is dead. The strategic effectiveness of the kamikaze campaign is substantial. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, kamikazes will sink 36 American ships and damage 368 others. Naval casualties exceed 4,900 sailors, killed more than died at Pearl Harbor, more than died in any other single naval campaign. The picket destroyers suffered disproportionately. 15 destroyers, or destroyer escorts, are sunk, another 80 damaged. The survival rate for crews on picket duty drops low enough that sailors openly compare it to a death sentence. Medical facilities on surviving ships report unprecedented psychiatric casualties among sailors who've survived kamikaze attacks, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, symptoms we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The constant threat of sudden death from above corrodes morale in ways that conventional combat does not. The American response to kamikazes involves both technological and tactical innovation. Radar-directed fire control improves anti-aircraft accuracy. Proximity-fused shells, which explode near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits, dramatically increase lethality of anti-aircraft fire. Combat air patrols, fighters orbiting the fleet intercept many kamikaze formations before they reach the ships. Fighter direction officers on picket destroyers coordinate these intercepts, vectoring Hellcats and Corsairs onto incoming raids. Hundreds of kamikazes are shot down before reaching their targets, but hundreds get through. The mathematics are unfavorable. If 100 kamikazes attack and 90 are shot down, the 10 that get through can still sink multiple ships, and Japan has plenty of aircraft and pilots to throw away. The contrast between the ground campaign and the naval campaign is stark. On land, American forces are grinding forward at terrible cost, but are at least making progress. At sea, the fleet is absorbing punishment while providing fire support and supplies to the ground forces. Unable to eliminate the kamikaze threat, because the aircraft launching the attacks operate from airfields in Japan itself, beyond the reach of American ground forces. The fleet can defend itself, can shoot down individual attackers, but cannot stop the attacks from coming. Admiral Spruance seriously considers withdrawing the fleet from Okinawan waters, which would cripple the ground offensive. He doesn't, the mission is too important, but the fact that withdrawal is even discussed reveals how effective the kamikaze campaign has become. The psychological dimension of kamikaze warfare extends beyond immediate terror. American sailors begin questioning what kind of enemy they're fighting. An enemy willing to sacrifice thousands of pilots in suicide attacks seems fanatical beyond reason, utterly alien to American cultural concepts of warfare. This perception has consequences. If the Japanese will mount suicide attacks to defend an outlying island like Okinawa, what will they do when America invades the home islands? The casualty projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, begin incorporating assumptions about mass civilian resistance, about an entire population willing to fight to the death. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa thus influence not just the immediate battle, but the strategic calculus of ending the war. They make the atomic bomb seem like a more reasonable alternative to invasion. Because if Japan will sacrifice thousands of pilots in suicide missions at Okinawa, perhaps only something as apocalyptic as nuclear weapons can convince them to surrender. By the end of April, the kamikaze threat has become a permanent feature of the Okinawa campaign. Kikusui attacks come in waves, scheduled to coincide with phases of the ground offensive. Ships' crews develop fatalistic attitudes. Every day on picket duty is another day to potentially die. Sailors scan the skies constantly, knowing that death can appear from any direction with minimal warning. The divine wind is blowing, and it's carrying death on unprecedented scale. For the American fleet supporting Operation Iceberg, the ocean around Okinawa has become as dangerous as any battlefield. And unlike the ground campaign, where troops can dig in and find some protection, ships on the ocean are exposed targets. The kamikazes are teaching American forces a brutal lesson. Japanese desperation is not weakness. It's a different kind of strength, one that makes Okinawa uniquely costly, and the attacks are far from over. More Kikusui operations are planned, more ships will burn, more sailors will die. The divine wind will blow until one side or the other breaks. May 2nd, 1945, 10 to 100 hours. At 10th Army Headquarters, established in a former Japanese barracks outside Kadena Airfield, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner reviews casualty reports with growing concern. 6,000 Americans killed in the past 3 weeks. 15,000 wounded. Medical evacuation ships running constantly to rear area hospitals. And territorial gains? The Machinado line has been penetrated, barely. The shoreline, the main Japanese defensive position, hasn't even been seriously tested yet. At this rate, Buckner calculates, the campaign could last another 2 months. Casualties could reach 30,000 or more. Unacceptable numbers, strategically and politically. But what alternative exists? Across the table, Marine Major General Roy Geiger is about to propose one, and Buckner is about to reject it. The decision will haunt historical analysis of Okinawa for the next 80 years. The strategic situation in early May demands fresh thinking. American forces have bludgeoned their way through the outer defenses at horrific cost. The Japanese 32nd Army, despite losing perhaps 30,000 men, remains intact as a fighting force, dug into positions around Shuri Castle that make the Machinado line look weak by comparison. American advantages in artillery and air power have proven insufficient to dislodge defenders from cave systems and underground positions. The frontal assault strategy, while making slow progress, is destroying American units faster than they can be reinforced or rested. And intelligence reports indicate that even if Shuri falls, the Japanese have prepared fallback positions on the Kion Peninsula that could extend the campaign indefinitely. Something needs to change. But what? Geiger's proposal is tactically sound and operationally daring. The Marines, having secured northern Okinawa with relatively light casualties, are available for redeployment. Geiger suggests an amphibious end-run land, the 1st Marine Division on the southern coast of Okinawa, behind Japanese lines, near Minatoga Beach. This would force Ushijima into an impossible situation. His forces are concentrated around Shuri, facing north against Buckner's frontal assault. A Marine division landing behind him would threaten his supply lines, his command structure, his entire defensive position. Ushijima would have to choose: maintain positions at Shuri and risk being cut off, or withdraw south and abandon the fortifications he spent months preparing. Either choice would break the stalemate. Geiger argues the plan could end the campaign weeks earlier and save thousands of lives. It's the kind of bold maneuver that MacArthur used successfully in the Philippines, leapfrogging Japanese strongpoints rather than reducing them frontally. Buckner's rejection of the plan rests on several concerns, some valid, some debatable. First, logistics. An amphibious landing requires enormous shipping resources, transports, landing craft, supply vessels. Many of these are currently supporting the main offensive. Diverting them for an amphibious operation would disrupt ongoing operations. Second, the kamikaze threat. Ships conducting an amphibious landing would be vulnerable, stationary targets for hours during the landing phase. The fleet has already suffered heavily from kamikaze attacks. Exposing more ships to concentrated air attacks seems reckless. Third, the terrain. Southern Okinawa's beaches are less suitable for landing than the Higuchi beaches used on L-Day. Coral reefs, poor exits from the beach, and the proximity of Japanese positions could turn a landing into a disaster. Finally, there's the question of what happens after the landing. Even if Marines get ashore successfully, they'd be isolated behind enemy lines, depending on supply by sea, fighting in terrain the Japanese have fortified. Buckner argues the risks outweigh potential benefits. The debate reveals deeper tensions within American command structure. Marines and Army have different tactical philosophies. Marines emphasize aggressive maneuver, mobility, taking risks to achieve breakthrough. Army doctrine emphasizes systematic reduction of enemy positions, using firepower to minimize casualties, methodical rather than daring. Neither approach is inherently superior, they're suited to different situations. The question is whether Okinawa, in May 1945, is a situation that calls for daring maneuver or methodical reduction. Geiger and other Marine commanders believe maneuver offers the only path forward that doesn't involve another month of meat-grinder combat. Buckner and his Army commanders believe the proposed landing is a gamble that could result in disaster. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding all Pacific operations, visits Okinawa in early May to assess the situation personally. He tours the front lines, talks to commanders, reviews casualty reports. Privately, he's shocked by what he sees: exhausted troops, decimated units, officers who look 20 years older than their actual age. The campaign has become a stalemate, and stalemates favor defenders. Nimitz meets with Buckner and listens to the amphibious landing proposal. Then he asks pointed questions. How long will the current approach take? Buckner estimates 6 to 8 more weeks. At what cost? Perhaps 20,000 more casualties. Nimitz presses. Could an amphibious landing shorten the campaign? Buckner concedes it might, but reiterates his concerns about risks. Nimitz doesn't order Buckner to execute the landing, but he makes clear his dissatisfaction with the current pace. The meeting ends inconclusively. Buckner will continue the frontal assault. The debate will continue in historical scholarship. The human cost of Buckner's decision becomes clear over the following weeks. Units continue battering themselves against Japanese positions. The 77th Division, fresh from victories in the Philippines, is committed to the Shuri front and immediately begins taking casualties at rates that stagger its commanders. The 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Peleliu, are eventually thrown into the southern offensive and discover that their experience counts for little against fortified positions that refuse to break. Casualty rates in some rifle companies exceed 80%. Men who survive multiple battles die assaulting anonymous ridges whose names appear in no history books. And always, there's the question that haunts survivors. What if? The counterfactual, what would have happened if Buckner had authorized the amphibious landing, remains one of World War II's great unanswered questions. Proponents argue the landing would have forced a Japanese withdrawal from Shuri, saving weeks of fighting and thousands of lives. Critics argue the landing force would have been isolated, vulnerable to counterattack, and potentially destroyed. We'll never know, because the operation wasn't attempted. What we do know is that the decision to continue frontal assault meant the meat grinder kept grinding. More Kakuzu ridges, more Sugarloaf hills, more weeks of blowtorch and corkscrew tactics against positions that should have been bypassed. The human cost continued mounting. The strategic debate extends beyond Okinawa to the larger question of how to end the Pacific War. Every casualty on Okinawa influences planning for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. If Okinawa, a relatively small island, costs 50,000 casualties, what will invading Kyushu cost? What about Honshu, Japan's main island? The projections become nightmarish. Buckner's methodical approach, while costly, at least makes steady progress. But it validates Japanese defensive doctrine that fortified positions can exact terrible casualties, even against overwhelming American material superiority. This validation, ironically, strengthens the argument for using atomic weapons rather than invading Japan conventionally. If the path to Tokyo leads through a dozen Okinawas, then alternatives to invasion become more attractive. The personality dimension of the debate matters more than strategic analysis usually acknowledges. Buckner is a careful, methodical commander, son of a Confederate general, raised on stories of frontal assaults that ended in slaughter. He's determined not to waste lives on risky operations. But his caution results in a different kind of waste-grinding attrition that destroys units while making slow progress. Geiger is aggressive, confident, willing to take risks if the potential payoff is high. But his aggression might have led to disaster if the landing had been attempted and failed. Command decisions are made by humans with personalities, biases, and blind spots. The Okinawa strategy debate reflects this human dimension. Neither Buckner nor Geiger is wrong in any simple sense. They're approaching an impossible problem from different philosophical directions. The debate also reveals the limits of American military doctrine in May 1945. The U.S. military has spent 3 years perfecting the techniques of amphibious assault and island warfare. Those techniques work brilliantly at getting ashore and establishing beachheads. They work less well at breaking fortified defensive positions that exploit terrain to nullify American advantages. No amount of artillery can dislodge an enemy living in caves. No amount of naval gunfire can reach tunnels 100 feet underground. Air support helps, but planes cannot see cave entrances camouflaged to be invisible from above. The only solution is infantry, supported by flamethrowers and demolitions, physically clearing positions one by one. And that solution, while effective, is horrifically expensive in lives and time. By mid-May, the strategic situation remains deadlocked despite American material superiority. The shoreline has been penetrated in places, but not broken. Japanese defenders continue fighting from positions prepared months in advance. American casualties continue mounting at rates that alarm commanders and medical personnel. And the question lingers, could a different approach have achieved the same results at lower cost? The answer depends on whom you ask. Marine commanders, to this day, argue that Buckner's caution cost American lives. Army historians defend his methodical approach as the only realistic option given the kamikaze threat and terrain limitations. Both positions have merit. Both ignore the fundamental reality. Okinawa was always going to be expensive. The only questions were how expensive and who would pay the price. The strategy debate determined some of those answers, but not all of them, because ahead still lay the main battle for Shuri, and beyond that, the final desperate fighting on Kion Peninsula. The decisions made in early May would shape those battles, and those battles would shape history. May 21st, 1945, 0300 hours. Corporal Dan Lawler, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, wakes to water dripping on his face. He's in a foxhole scraped from mud on the forward slope of Wana Ridge, 400 yards from Shuri Castle. It's been raining for 3 days straight. Not normal rain, a torrential monsoon that's turned southern Okinawa into a swamp. Lawler's foxhole, dug carefully into coral 3 days ago, is now a pool of reddish-brown water. His uniform is soaked through. His rifle is caked in mud. Around him, other Marines huddle miserably, trying to stay warm in 70-degree temperatures that feel freezing when you're wet for 72 hours straight. In the darkness, Lawler hears a sound that makes his stomach clench, the gurgling cry of a wounded man drowning in a water-filled crater. They can't reach him. The ground between positions is swept by Japanese machine guns, so they listen to him die, slowly, over 30 minutes. This is what the battle for Shuri has become. Hell, but wet. The monsoon rains that begin May 21st transform the battlefield in ways that benefit no one and hurt everyone. Southern Okinawa's terrain consists of coral limestone, covered by a thin layer of soil. Normally, this soil is firm, capable of supporting vehicles and foot traffic. But 3 days of rain, 10 inches in 72 hours, turns the soil to liquid mud. Roads disappear. Supply trails become impassable. Tanks, critically important for providing direct fire support, bog down and become useless. Wheeled vehicles sink to their axles. Supply lines, already strained by constant Japanese artillery interdiction, collapse completely. Frontline units run short of ammunition, food, water. Worse, casualty evacuation becomes nearly impossible. Wounded men must be carried on stretchers through knee-deep mud, a process that takes 8 man-hours to move one casualty to an aid station. Some wounded drown in flooded foxholes before stretcher bearers can reach them. The rain doesn't stop the fighting. Both sides continue operations, but it makes everything exponentially more difficult. The strategic objective of the Shuri offensive is deceptively simple. Break through the Japanese main defensive line, centered on Shuri Castle, and force a general withdrawal. But simple doesn't mean easy. The Shuri line consists of concentric defensive positions, extending 5 miles in every direction from the castle. These aren't just trenches and foxholes, they're an integrated network of fortified ridges, each supporting the others with interlocking fire. Attack Wana Ridge, and you're exposed to fire from Wana Draw, Sugarloaf Hill, and Half Moon Hill. Attack Sugarloaf, and you take fire from Horseshoe Ridge and the Shuri Heights. Every position supports every other position. Yahara's defensive philosophy reaches its apex here. He's created a defensive system where you cannot attack any single point without being engaged by multiple positions simultaneously. Breaking through requires reducing the entire network, not just taking individual hills. The battle for Sugarloaf Hill exemplifies the horrors of the Shuri offensive. Sugarloaf is an unremarkable rise of ground, perhaps 50 feet high, covering an area no larger than a football field. It's strategically important because it anchors the western end of the Shuri line. Take Sugarloaf, and you can roll up Japanese defenses along that flank. The 29th Marines attack Sugarloaf on May 12th. They take the hill by mid-afternoon, suffering moderate casualties. Then, as night falls, Japanese counterattack from connecting ridges and drive the Marines off. The next day, the Marines attack again, take the hill, lose it in a counterattack. This pattern repeats for 6 days. Marines assault Sugarloaf 11 times. 11 times, they reach the summit. 11 times, they're driven off by counterattacks or fire from adjacent positions. Casualties mount beyond comprehension. 2,600 Marines killed or wounded for one small hill. Finally, on May 18th, the 29th Marines take Sugarloaf and hold it, not because Japanese defenses have weakened, but because positions on the adjacent ridges have finally been reduced, eliminating the supporting fire that made Sugarloaf impossible to hold. The human experience of fighting for these ridges transcends normal combat horror. Corporal Sterling Mace, 22nd Marines, describes Wana Draw, a ravine between Wana Ridge and Wana Hill, as a moonscape of mud, bodies, and wrecked equipment. The draw is swept by fire from both sides, making movement suicidal during daylight. At night, both sides send patrols into the draw, resulting in savage close-quarters combat. Bodies accumulate in the mud, impossible to retrieve. Wounded men call for help that cannot come. Marines describe the smell, a combination of mud, cordite, blood, and decomposition that permeates everything. You cannot escape it. It's in your nostrils, in your clothes, in your dreams. Years later, survivors report being unable to tolerate the smell of certain things, wet earth, rotting vegetation, because it triggers memories of Wana Draw. The strategic situation becomes increasingly complex as the Shuri offensive progresses. American intelligence detects signs of Japanese movement, suggesting a possible withdrawal. Patrols report abandoned positions. The volume of Japanese artillery fire decreases. Is this a trap designed to lure Americans into a killing zone? Or are the Japanese actually retreating? General Buckner faces a difficult decision. If the Japanese are withdrawing and he pursues aggressively, he might turn an orderly retreat into a rout, destroying the 32nd Army. But if it's a trap and he commits forces to rapid pursuit, he could suffer catastrophic casualties. Buckner chooses caution, maintaining steady pressure but not gambling on all-out pursuit. It's the same methodical approach that characterized his earlier decisions, and it produces similar results: progress, but slow progress. The Japanese decision to withdraw from Shuri is, in fact, one of the war's most difficult command choices. General Ushijima and Colonel Yahara debate for days. Traditional Japanese military doctrine demands defending Shuri to the last man. Withdrawing violates every principle of Bushido, every expectation of honorable conduct. But Yahara argues cold logic. The 32nd Army still has 30,000 effective troops. If they die at Shuri, the campaign ends in weeks. If they withdraw to the prepared defenses on Kion Peninsula, they can continue the battle for another month or more. More American casualties, more delay for the invasion of Japan, more fulfillment of their mission. Ushijima listens to both arguments, honor versus strategic utility, and makes the hardest decision of his career. They will withdraw. On May 22nd, under cover of continuing rain and reduced visibility, the 32nd Army begins abandoning Shuri. The withdrawal is a masterpiece of military discipline under impossible conditions. Japanese forces are withdrawing while in contact with the enemy, during a monsoon, across terrain that's barely passable. Small rearguard units remain in forward positions, keeping up enough fire to convince Americans that defenses are still fully manned. The main body moves south through the rain and darkness, carrying what supplies they can, abandoning heavy equipment, and wounded too severely injured to march. American intelligence detects movement but cannot determine its scale. Is this a general withdrawal or tactical repositioning? Patrols are sent forward cautiously. They occupy positions the Japanese held days earlier and find them empty. The realization spreads slowly. The Japanese are gone. Shuri is falling. But falling doesn't mean destroyed. The Japanese army is escaping to fight again. May 29, 1945. Marines of the 1st Division reach the ruins of Shuri Castle. The ancient fortress, once the seat of Ryukyu kings, has been pulverized by American artillery and naval gunfire. The castle's stone walls are rubble. The surrounding city is flattened. Nothing moves except American troops picking their way through the destruction. A company commander orders a flag raised briefly. A Confederate flag goes up, reflecting the 1st Marine Division's southern origins, then is quickly replaced with the American flag. Photographers capture the moment. It looks triumphant. It looks like victory. But veterans know better. Shuri has been taken, but at a cost of 7,000 American casualties. And the Japanese army that was supposed to be trapped and destroyed at Shuri has escaped. The campaign is not over. It's not even close to over. The rains finally stop on June 1st, and the battlefield reveals itself in daylight. The landscape is apocalyptic. Shuri and its surrounding ridges look like images from the Western Front in World War I. Mud stretches in every direction. Wrecked vehicles, tanks, trucks, Amtraks are scattered across the terrain, abandoned where they bogged down. Shell craters are so dense they overlap. Trees have been reduced to splintered stumps. And everywhere, bodies. American bodies in forward positions, awaiting burial teams, Japanese bodies in defensive positions, left where they fell. The smell is overpowering. Burial details work around the clock for weeks, collecting remains, trying to identify American dead, bulldozing Japanese corpses into mass graves. The battle for Shuri is over. But the psychological scars remain. Survivors describe the landscape with phrases like, "Hell on earth," "the end of the world," "worse than anything I imagined war could be." The strategic assessment of the Shuri operation reveals both success and failure. Success. The Japanese main defensive line has been broken. The keystone of Yahara's defensive strategy has fallen. American forces now control central Okinawa and the approaches to the south. Failure. The Japanese army escaped largely intact. Instead of destroying the 32nd Army at Shuri, American forces will now have to fight them again on the Kian Peninsula. Buckner's cautious pursuit allowed the Japanese to execute a successful withdrawal. How many American lives could have been saved if the Japanese army had been trapped and destroyed at Shuri? Hundreds? Thousands? It's a question that will haunt military historians and inform debates about aggressive versus cautious command decisions. What's undeniable is this: the campaign continues. Ahead lies Kian, where 30,000 Japanese troops are digging into prepared positions, ready to sell their lives as expensively as possible. The monsoon is over. Shuri has fallen. But Okinawa isn't finished with American forces yet. The final phase is about to begin, and it will be the bloodiest yet. April 6th, 1945, 1500 hours. In the engineering spaces of the battleship Yamato, Petty Officer Naoyuki Uchida monitors gauges that tell a story the crew isn't supposed to know. The fuel bunkers are 60% full enough to reach Okinawa, not enough to return. The entire crew understands what this means. Operation Tengo is a one-way mission. Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, is being sent on a suicide attack against the American fleet off Okinawa. No air cover, minimal escort, just enough fuel to reach the battle zone. The orders are explicit: beach Yamato on Okinawa's shores, and use her massive 18.1-inch guns as coastal artillery until ammunition runs out, then have the crew die fighting as ground troops. It's a mission that combines desperation, honor, and futility in equal measure. Uchida checks his gauges again and tries not to think about the fact that he's never going to see Japan again. None of them are. The decision to send Yamato on a suicide mission reflects Japanese strategic desperation in early April 1945. The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer exists as a credible fighting force. Most capital ships are sunk, damaged beyond repair, or trapped in ports without fuel. Japan's carrier fleet, once the most powerful in the Pacific, is destroyed. What remains is scattered, undersupplied, and unable to challenge American naval dominance. Yamato herself is a relic of a bygone era, built when battleship supremacy still mattered, now obsolete in an age of carrier aviation. She's consumed enormous resources and achieved almost nothing. The battleship has participated in exactly one surface engagement, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where she fired her main batteries at American escort carriers before withdrawing. Now, in April 45, Naval High Command decides Yamato's final mission will at least be memorable. Rather than let the battleship rust at anchor, they'll send her to die fighting. The strategic justification for Operation Tengo is paper-thin. In theory, Yamato and her escorts will break through American naval pickets, reach Okinawa, and disrupt the invasion by bombarding American positions and potentially engaging American capital ships. In practice, everyone involved knows this is fantasy. Yamato will be spotted by American reconnaissance long before reaching Okinawa. American carrier aircraft will attack in overwhelming numbers. Without air cover or adequate anti-aircraft ammunition, Yamato cannot survive. But the operation serves a different purpose, symbolic rather than strategic. It demonstrates that Japan is willing to sacrifice its greatest warship rather than surrender. It shows the troops defending Okinawa that the Navy shares their commitment to fight to the death. And it fulfills a peculiarly Japanese concept of honor that requires making the gesture even when the gesture is futile. Yamato departs Tokuyama on April 6th with a skeleton crew 3,300 men, instead of her full complement of over 4,000. Admiral Seiichi Ito commands, knowing this is his death ride. The battle group includes light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. They carry enough ammunition for one engagement, enough fuel for a one-way trip. No arrangements exist for retreat or withdrawal. The orders are simple: reach Okinawa or die trying. Probably die trying. As the fleet clears Japanese coastal waters, sailors write final letters to their families. Officers give speeches that mix traditional Japanese naval rhetoric with stark acknowledgement of reality. Admiral Ito tells his staff, "We shall die magnificent deaths." This is what the Navy demands. It's a 19th century sentiment applied to a 20th century situation, and the result will be predictable. American surveillance detects Yamato's sortie almost immediately. Submarines shadowing Japanese home waters report the battleship's departure and course. The information reaches Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, within hours. Spruance makes a cold calculation. American carriers are supporting operations on Okinawa, providing air cover and ground support. Diverting them to attack Yamato means temporarily reducing that support. But allowing Yamato to reach Okinawa, however unlikely that outcome, risks American lives. The decision is obvious. Sink Yamato before she can threaten the invasion fleet. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the Fast Carrier Task Force, receives orders to launch a maximum strike. He orders nearly 400 aircraft dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters to destroy the Japanese task force. It's overkill by any measure. But Mitcher takes no chances with the world's largest battleship. April 7th, 12:20 hours. Yamato's lookouts spot the first American reconnaissance aircraft. Admiral Ito knows what's coming. He orders the battle group to increase to maximum speed, to maneuver radically, to prepare for air attack. The crew has drilled for this scenario countless times. Anti-aircraft guns are manned and ready. Damage control parties stand by. But preparations matter little when you're outnumbered hundreds to one. The first attack wave appears at 1300 hours, over 200 aircraft, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries open fire, throwing up walls of exploding shells. The battleship's massive silhouette disappears in the smoke and spray of near misses. But the attacks keep coming. The physics of the attack favor the Americans overwhelmingly. Yamato, despite her size and armor, is just one ship. She has perhaps 200 anti-aircraft guns of various calibers. Impressive, but not sufficient against hundreds of aircraft attacking in coordinated waves. American pilots have trained for this approach from different altitudes and directions simultaneously, overwhelming the battleship's defensive fire. Torpedo bombers come in low, skimming the waves. Dive bombers attack from above. The battleship can't defend against both simultaneously. The first torpedo strikes port side, causing flooding in several compartments. Damage control parties respond, but more torpedoes hit before repairs can be effected. Bombs penetrate Yamato's deck armor, exploding inside the ship, starting fires that spread despite all efforts to contain them. Yamato's death takes 2 hours. The battleship absorbs punishment that would sink any other vessel 10 times over. 10 torpedo hits, 7 bomb hits. American pilots describe her as the toughest target we ever attacked, absorbing ordnance that should have sunk her immediately and continuing to fight. Her anti-aircraft batteries fire until ammunition runs out or the guns are destroyed. Crew members abandon destroyed positions and man whatever weapons remain functional, but there's no saving the ship. By 1400 hours, Yamato is listing 20 degrees to port, flooding through torn hull plating, fires burning out of control. Admiral Ito goes down with his ship, as do most of the crew. At 1423 hours, Yamato's magazines detonate. The explosion is visible from 60 miles away, a pillar of fire and smoke that rises thousands of feet. When the smoke clears, the battleship is gone. 3,055 sailors are dead. Only 276 survive, pulled from the water by Japanese destroyers before those ships flee the area. The strategic impact of Yamato's loss is negligible. One battleship, already obsolete, removed from an order of battle where it was largely irrelevant. The psychological impact is profound. Yamato represented Japanese naval power in its purest form. Her destruction symbolizes the complete defeat of the Imperial Navy. More than that, the manner of her destruction, sent on a suicide mission without realistic chance of success, reveals Japan's strategic bankruptcy. The nation is reduced to symbolic gestures, to sacrificing its greatest weapons not for tactical advantage, but for honor. American intelligence analyzes the operation with something between respect and horror. respect for the courage of sailors who sailed knowing they wouldn't return, horror at a command structure that would order such waste. The human stories from Yamato's final voyage reveal war's complexity. Among the survivors is Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, who describes watching the ship die from a lifeboat. He sees men trapped below decks, unable to escape as the battleship capsizes. He watches Admiral Ito standing on the bridge as water rises around him, saluting the Emperor as the ship goes under. Years later, Yoshida writes that Yamato's crew knew the mission was futile but went anyway because refusing would dishonor their families and themselves. It's a cultural context American forces struggle to understand. How can intelligent men accept suicide orders? Why not surrender, or refuse, or mutiny? The answer lies in concepts of duty and honor that don't translate easily across cultural boundaries. The American response to Operation Tengo is efficient and brutal. They lose 10 aircraft and 12 airmen, destroying the entire Japanese task force. Yamato, Yahagi, and 4 destroyers sunk, the remaining destroyers fleeing back to Japan damaged and demoralized. It's the kind of lopsided victory that characterized the Pacific War's final year. American material and technological superiority is so overwhelming that Japanese forces, however brave or skilled, cannot achieve meaningful tactical success. The mathematics don't support it. When one side has hundreds of aircraft and the other has none, when one side has radar and the other doesn't, when one side can replace losses and the other cannot, victory is predetermined. The only variable is the cost. Yamato's mission cost Japan a battleship and 3,000 lives. It cost America 12 lives, and delayed Okinawa air support operations by several hours. That's the exchange rate in April 1945. The long-term significance of Yamato's destruction extends beyond the immediate tactical situation. The operation becomes symbolic of Japan's entire strategic position in the war's final months, still capable of impressive feats of arms, but no longer capable of affecting strategic outcomes. The kamikazes are sinking ships off Okinawa, but not enough ships to force withdrawal. The defenders on Okinawa are inflicting terrible casualties, but not enough to stop the American advance. And Yamato, the ultimate symbol of conventional naval power, is sent to die in a gesture that accomplishes nothing except honoring abstract concepts of duty. This combination of effectiveness and futility will characterize Japanese resistance for the remainder of the war. They will fight skillfully and bravely. They will inflict casualties out of proportion to their numbers, but they will not win. They cannot win. The only question is how long they'll continue fighting, and how many will die before reality is acknowledged. For the 3,300 sailors of Yamato, that question was answered on April 7, 1945, in the waters southwest of Kyushu, when the greatest battleship ever built broke apart and sank, taking Japan's naval pride to the bottom of the Pacific. April 23, 1945, 1400 hours. 12-year-old Masahito Ota crouches in a limestone cave on southern Okinawa with 40 other civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. They've been hiding for 3 weeks, since Japanese soldiers forced them from their homes to make room for military positions. The cave is dark, humid, rank with the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste. Food ran out 2 days ago. Water is nearly gone. Outside, they can hear artillery fire, the rumble of tank engines, shouted commands in a language none of them understand. American voices. The Japanese soldiers who forced them into this cave told them Americans would torture and kill anyone they captured, showed them grenades, and told them suicide was preferable to capture. Young Oda watches his grandmother clutch one of those grenades, her face resigned to what she believes must be done. He doesn't understand that his people, Okinawans, neither fully Japanese nor fully independent, have become expendable in a conflict between empires. He only knows that death seems inevitable, and the only choice is how to die. This is what the Battle of Okinawa means for the island's 450,000 civilians. They are not combatants, but they will die like combatants, because their island has become a battlefield, and battlefields don't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. The Okinawan tragedy begins long before the first American soldier lands. The Ryukyu Kingdom, of which Okinawa is the heart, maintained independence for centuries as a tributary state to China, while trading with Japan. In 1879, Japan forcibly annexed the islands, abolished the monarchy, and began a decades-long campaign to erase Okinawan identity. The Okinawan language, linguistically distinct from Japanese, is banned in schools. Okinawan cultural practices are discouraged or prohibited. Children are taught they are Japanese, though mainland Japanese continue treating them as inferior, second-class citizens. By 1945, Okinawans occupy an uncomfortable middle ground, forced to demonstrate loyalty to an empire that doesn't fully accept them, yet possessing a separate identity that persists despite suppression. When war comes to their island, they discover their loyalty is assumed, but their safety is irrelevant. They are resources to be consumed, not citizens to be protected. Japanese military authorities begin preparing Okinawa for defense in late 1944, and these preparations devastate civilian life. Entire villages are evacuated to make room for military installations. Farmers are forced to dig fortifications instead of planting crops, leading to food shortages. Schools are closed, the buildings converted to barracks or supply depots. And most ominously, Okinawan males of military age are conscripted into the Boei-tai, the Home Guard. These 20,000 men receive minimal training, inferior weapons, often rifles from the Russo-Japanese War or hand grenades, and are integrated into Japanese defensive positions. They are not professional soldiers. They are farmers, fishermen, shopkeepers, pressed into military service with no choice and little hope of survival. Their families watch them march away, knowing most will never return. The militarization of Okinawan youth represents one of the war's most disturbing aspects. Japanese authorities create the Blood and Iron Student Corps, conscripting boys aged 14 to 17 from Okinawa's middle schools and high schools. Officially, these children will serve as messengers, scouts, and laborers. In reality, many are given explosives and told to destroy American tanks by crawling underneath them human anti-tank mines. Girls are organized into nursing units called himeyuri, expected to care for Japanese wounded in battlefield conditions, with no medical training and minimal supplies. These teenage girls work in field hospitals that are actually cave systems, tending to soldiers with horrific wounds, amputating limbs with kitchen knives, watching men die by the dozens while artillery bombardment shakes rock dust from the cave ceilings. Many of these student nurses are killed when American forces assault cave systems without knowing civilians are inside. Others commit suicide when their positions are overrun, having been told Americans will rape and murder them. As the battle intensifies through April and May, Okinawan civilians find themselves trapped between opposing forces. Japanese soldiers demand absolute obedience, treating any hesitation as treason. Civilians who speak Okinawan language rather than Japanese are suspected of collaborating with Americans. American Nisei translators speak Japanese but not Okinawan, so the language becomes grounds for suspicion. Japanese soldiers confiscate food from civilian stocks, leaving families to starve. When cave systems become contested, soldiers force civilians out to make room for military equipment. Women and children are sent into artillery barrages to make room for ammunition storage. The protection civilians might expect from their own military evaporates under the pressure of total war. Survival trumps obligation, and civilians are expendable. The American advance creates its own dangers for Okinawan civilians. American forces are understandably suspicious of any Okinawans they encounter. Japanese forces have used civilians as shields, have disguised soldiers as civilians, have sent women with concealed explosives into American lines. This leads to tragic encounters where frightened civilians fleeing combat are shot by equally frightened American soldiers who think they're facing an attack. American artillery and naval gunfire, aimed at Japanese positions, cannot distinguish military from civilian targets when both occupy the same terrain. Caves sheltering families are sealed by flamethrower teams who have no way to know civilians are inside. The United States military is not intentionally targeting civilians, but the nature of the combat makes civilian casualties inevitable. When every cave might contain enemy soldiers, every figure moving in the dark might be an infiltrator, every structure might conceal a sniper, the fog of war becomes lethal to everyone. Japanese propaganda compounds the tragedy by convincing many Okinawans that capture by Americans means torture, rape, and death. Soldiers tell civilians that American troops are savages who will mutilate prisoners. They show propaganda films of alleged American atrocities in other Pacific battles. When American forces approach, some Okinawan families choose mass suicide rather than surrender. The cliffs at Mabuni, at Okinawa's southern tip, become sites of horrific tragedy. Entire families, parents, grandparents, children, jump to their deaths on the rocks below rather than face capture. Some are forced by Japanese soldiers at gunpoint. Others jump willingly, believing the propaganda. American troops advancing through these areas discover bodies of children floating in the surf and are traumatized by what Japanese indoctrination has convinced Okinawans to do. Estimates suggest thousands of Okinawan civilians commit suicide during the campaign, a number that haunts survivors for generations. Japanese atrocities against Okinawan civilians, though less publicized than other aspects of the battle, are extensive and brutal. Okinawans suspected of collaboration, sometimes on no evidence beyond speaking to American troops or accepting food, are executed by Japanese soldiers. Families found with American goods are killed as traitors. When food becomes scarce, Japanese troops prioritize military consumption and let civilians starve. Women are raped by Japanese soldiers, a fact carefully suppressed in Japanese accounts but documented in Okinawan testimony. Okinawan men conscripted into the Boitai who try to surrender or retreat are shot by Japanese officers for cowardice. The 32nd Army treats Okinawans as resources to be used up, not people to be protected. This treatment creates a bitter legacy. Okinawan survivors often report fearing Japanese soldiers more than American troops, a remarkable statement given the circumstances. American efforts to protect and care for Okinawan civilians are well-intentioned but inadequate. As American forces advance, they establish internment camps for displaced civilians. These camps grow rapidly by war's end. Over 200,000 Okinawans are interned. The camps provide basic food and medical care, but conditions are grim. Overcrowding leads to disease. Food supplies are insufficient for the numbers involved. Medical care is overwhelmed by malnutrition, wounds, and trauma. Children die of preventable diseases. Elderly internees succumb to exposure and lack of care. The American military is trying to manage a humanitarian crisis while conducting combat operations, and the humanitarian mission suffers from lack of resources and attention. The camps keep civilians from immediate combat zones, but protected is relative when you're sleeping in a tent, eating subsistence rations, and watching family members die from neglect. The linguistic and cultural barriers between Americans and Okinawans create additional tragedy. American Nisei translators speak Japanese but rarely speak Okinawan, so communication with civilians is difficult. Many Okinawans, especially elderly or rural people, speak little Japanese and cannot communicate with their supposed rescuers. This leads to situations where civilians cannot explain where they're from, cannot describe their medical conditions, cannot ask for specific help. American soldiers, themselves traumatized by weeks of combat, lack patience or cultural understanding to deal with terrified civilians. Misunderstandings lead to unnecessary suffering. A civilian trying to return to their village is stopped at a checkpoint and detained because they cannot explain their intentions. A family seeking medical care is turned away because translators are unavailable. The fog of war extends beyond combat to encompass the entire human experience of Okinawa in 1945. The scale of Okinawan civilian casualties is difficult to establish precisely, but almost certainly exceeds 100,000 dead, roughly 1/4 of the pre-war population. This makes Okinawa one of the war's great civilian catastrophes, comparable to the bombing of Dresden or Tokyo, but less known internationally. Some deaths are direct killed by artillery, bombs, or combat. Others are indirect starvation, disease, suicide, execution. Entire families are wiped out. Villages are depopulated. The social fabric of Okinawan society is torn apart. Children are orphaned by the thousands. Women lose husbands and sons. The elderly watch their descendants die before them. The psychological trauma is immeasurable. Survivors describe a form of survivor's guilt unique to Okinawa, guilt over surviving when so many died, guilt over actions taken to survive, guilt over the betrayal by both Japan and America that turned their island into a slaughterhouse. The long-term impact of the civilian tragedy shapes Okinawan identity for generations. After the war, Okinawa remains under American military occupation until 1972, 27 years after the battle. During that occupation, American forces appropriate over 20% of Okinawa's land area for military bases, displacing tens of thousands. Okinawans who lost everything in the war are now displaced again, their property taken for bases that remain operational in 2025. The island develops a profound anti-war sentiment, rooted in lived experience of war's horror. Okinawan peace activists point to their island's history as proof that war destroys everyone it touches, civilian and military alike. The Battle of Okinawa Memorial, the cornerstone of peace, lists the names of everyone who died Japanese, American, Okinawan, without distinction. It's a powerful statement. Death doesn't discriminate, and remembrance shouldn't either. The international community's relative ignorance of Okinawa's civilian catastrophe is itself part of the tragedy. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which occur just weeks after Okinawa's battle ends, dominate historical memory and moral discourse about the war's end. Okinawa is overshadowed, reduced to a military campaign rather than recognized as a humanitarian disaster. Japanese historical memory is complicated. Acknowledging Okinawan suffering requires acknowledging Japanese military abuses of Okinawan civilians, a topic many Japanese prefer to avoid. American memory focuses on military casualties and victory, sidelining the civilian cost. Okinawans themselves, caught between these narratives, struggle to have their experience recognized and remembered. Their tragedy is tripled. First, the suffering itself, then the abandonment by both nations involved. Finally, the historical amnesia that relegates their story to footnotes. Young Masahide Ota, that 12-year-old boy in the cave, survives the battle. His grandmother releases the grenade, but it's a dud. The detonator is corroded from humidity. American soldiers find them 2 days later, terrified and starving, but alive. Ota grows up to become a historian, dedicating his life to documenting what happened to Okinawa's civilians. His work ensures that at least some remember, that at least some understand, that the tragedy is not forgotten entirely. But for every survivor who can tell their story, dozens died whose stories are lost forever. The Okinawan tragedy is not just what happened, but also the silence that followed, the forgetting, the way history moves on while trauma remains, embedded in an island that tried to survive between empires and was crushed by both. June 11th, 1945, 0600 hours. First Lieutenant Frank Hagler, 7th Infantry Division, studies the terrain ahead through binoculars and feels his stomach knot. The Kian Peninsula stretches before him 8 miles of coral ridges, escarpments, and cliffs, all occupied by what remains of the Japanese 32nd Army. Intelligence estimates 30,000 Japanese troops are trapped on this peninsula, backed against the southern coast with nowhere to retreat. Which means, Hagler realizes, they're going to fight harder than ever. Trapped animals are dangerous. Trapped soldiers who believe death is preferable to surrender are apocalyptic. His battalion is tasked with assaulting a ridge system intelligence has designated Yaiju Dake. It looks like every other ridge they've assaulted: coral faces, invisible cave entrances, perfect fields of fire for defenders. Except this time, the Japanese have nowhere to run. This is where they'll make their last stand. Hagler lowers his binoculars and briefs his company commanders. Nobody asks about casualties. They all know. By the time Kian is secure, most of the men standing here won't be. That's just mathematics now. The meat grinder is reaching its final phase, and that phase will be the bloodiest yet. The strategic situation on the Kian Peninsula is unique in the Pacific War. Normally, Japanese forces fight until annihilated, but they occupy enough territory to conduct fighting withdrawals, to trade space for time. On Kian, space doesn't exist. The peninsula narrows to 3 miles wide at its base, then extends south for 8 miles before ending at sea cliffs. 30,000 Japanese troops are compressed into roughly 20 square miles. They cannot withdraw. Behind them is ocean. They cannot be reinforced. American forces control the sea and air. The only question is how long they can hold out and how many Americans they'll kill before being destroyed. Colonel Yahara's defensive philosophy reaches its logical conclusion here. Every position will be defended to annihilation. Every cave will be fought over. Every yard will cost blood. Because there's nothing left except buying time with lives. And Japanese soldiers, after 3 months of combat, have internalized this calculus completely. The terrain of Kion Peninsula favors defenders absolutely. Coral limestone ridges run east-west across the peninsula, each one a natural fortress. Kunishi Ridge, Misato Ridge, Hill 89, the Yaiju Dake Escarpment. These are not hills you assault, they're vertical cliffs you climb under fire. Cave systems riddling the ridges are so extensive that entire battalions can shelter underground, immune to artillery and air attack. The Japanese have had weeks to prepare these final positions while withdrawing from Shuri. They've stockpiled ammunition in the caves. They've sighted machine guns to cover every approach. They've pre-registered artillery and mortar fire on routes American forces must use to advance, and they've accepted that none of them will survive. This acceptance creates a terrible freedom. When you know you're going to die, you can focus entirely on killing as many enemies as possible before death comes. That's what makes Kion so deadly. The assault on Kunishi Ridge, beginning June 12, exemplifies the horror of the final phase. Kunishi is a coral ridge, 1,200 yards long, rising perhaps 60 feet above surrounding terrain. The 1st Marine Division is tasked with taking it. They attack at dawn, infantry advancing behind tanks, artillery pounding the ridge continuously, and they're met with fire so intense it stops the advance in its tracks. Machine guns from caves the Marines cannot see, mortars dropping with uncanny accuracy. Japanese soldiers emerging from tunnels behind American lines to attack from the rear, then disappearing underground before reinforcements arrive. The Marines take casualties at rates that shock even veterans of previous battles. By day's end, they've gained perhaps 200 yards and lost 100 men. The pattern repeats for 6 days. Advance, take casualties, dig in, get counterattacked at night, advance again the next morning. Kunishi Ridge doesn't fall until June 18, and when it does, the 1st Marine Division has suffered 1,150 casualties, roughly half a battalion lost for one ridge. The nature of the fighting degenerates into something primordial. This isn't warfare with fronts and flanks and maneuver. This is siege warfare from the Middle Ages translated to the 20th century. American forces surround Japanese positions and reduce them methodically. Flamethrower tanks burn cave entrances. Engineers blast openings with shaped charges. Infantry rushes in to clear the caves in close combat, bayonets, pistols, grenades, entrenching tools used as weapons. The fighting inside caves is nightmare fuel. Darkness broken only by flashlights and muzzle flashes. Japanese soldiers appearing suddenly from side tunnels. Close quarters combat where you cannot see who you're shooting. The air thick with smoke and the smell of burning flesh from flamethrower attacks. Men fight through tunnels that go on for hundreds of yards, never knowing if the next turn conceals an ambush. Casualties among cave-clearing teams approach 80% in some units. You volunteer for cave duty, knowing you probably won't survive. You do it anyway because someone has to, and you won't let your squad mates go alone. The psychological toll of Kion fighting breaks men in ways that previous battles didn't. 3 months of continuous combat has left survivors operating on instinct, reflexes honed by repetition but spirits crushed by accumulating trauma. Combat fatigue cases spike. Men who functioned through dozens of previous firefights suddenly cannot function. They freeze under fire. They cannot stop shaking. They burst into tears without provocation. Medical officers recognize combat exhaustion symptoms but lack the personnel to evacuate everyone who's psychologically damaged. The solution is brutal. Keep them in line unless they're completely non-functional. Hope they recover with rest, except that many won't. The alternative is pulling so many men out of line that units cannot maintain combat effectiveness. So traumatized men continue fighting, and their trauma deepens, and some break permanently. The human mind, it turns out, has limits. Push it too far, and it doesn't recover. Kian is pushing thousands of men too far. Japanese defensive tactics on Kian reach their ultimate evolution. Night infiltration becomes routine. Small groups of Japanese soldiers crawl through American lines after dark, attacking command posts, supply dumps, artillery positions. American troops learn to sleep in shifts, weapons always at hand, because night brings death on Kian. Japanese artillery, though reduced by attrition, fires precisely aimed barrages at American assembly areas. How do they know where Americans are gathering? Because their observation posts on the ridges overlook every meter of American-controlled territory. Snipers, positioned in seemingly impossible locations, pick off officers and NCOs. Radio operators become priority targets. Japanese defenders have learned that killing the radio man disrupts American coordination. Every tactical lesson the Japanese learned in 3 months of fighting is applied here, concentrated, refined to maximum lethality. American firepower on Kian reaches levels that seem excessive but prove necessary. Artillery fires 24 hours a day, shells arcing over American positions to crash into Japanese lines with metronomic regularity. Naval gunfire from battleships offshore pounds suspected Japanese positions, 16-inch shells creating explosions visible for miles. Airstrikes continue despite the risks of hitting friendly troops, fighters, and bombers. Drop napalm and high explosives on ridge systems just yards from American positions. The quantity of explosives dropped on Kian is staggering. One estimate suggests more tonnage of munitions expended per square mile on southern Okinawa than anywhere else in the Pacific War. And still, Japanese defenders emerge from caves, firing, killing, dying but not surrendering. The firepower advantage America possesses matters less when the enemy lives underground. You cannot kill what you cannot hit, and hitting an enemy in a cave requires entering the cave, which requires infantry, which requires casualties. The approach to Okinawa's southern coast, mid-June, reveals the apocalyptic landscape 3 months of combat has created. Villages that existed for centuries are obliterated, not damaged, obliterated. Not a single building remains standing in some areas. Fields that once grew sugarcane and sweet potatoes are cratered wastelands. The coral ridges, naturally white, are stained brown and red, mud and blood. Wrecked equipment litters the terrain. Burned out tanks, destroyed artillery pieces, abandoned trucks, and bodies. Despite burial details working continuously, bodies remain Japanese dead in defensive positions, too dangerous to retrieve until the position is secured, which might take days or weeks. The smell is overpowering, inescapable. Veterans describe it as something that never leaves you, a sense memory that persists for decades. You can be sitting in a restaurant 50 years later, and certain smells trigger flashbacks to Kian, to the bodies, to the caves, to the dying. The Japanese counterattack on June 18 represents the 32nd Army's final coordinated offensive action. Knowing the end is near, senior officers order a nighttime counterattack along the entire front. Thousands of Japanese soldiers emerge from positions and attack, many armed only with bayonets or swords, some carrying explosives to use as suicide weapons. It's a banzai charge in all but name, the mass frontal assault that Yahara's defensive philosophy was supposed to avoid. But with the battle lost and death inevitable, traditional concepts of honor reassert themselves. Better to die attacking than wait to be burned alive in a cave. The counterattack is slaughtered. American positions, by this point in the campaign, are fortified and manned by troops who've learned hard lessons. Machine guns cut down wave after wave of attackers. Artillery drops pre-registered fires on approach routes. By dawn, hundreds of Japanese bodies lie in front of American lines. The counterattack accomplishes nothing except confirming what everyone already knew. The 32nd Army is in its death throes. June 21, 1945. American forces reach Okinawa's southern coast, a line of cliffs where land meets ocean. Japanese defenders are literally cornered, trapped between American forces and the sea. Small groups fight on in isolated pockets, but organized resistance is collapsing. Soldiers emerge from caves with hands raised in surrender, a sight so rare it shocks American troops who've been fighting for 3 months without seeing a single surrender. Others choose death. Soldiers in caves with no ammunition commit suicide with grenades. Officers shoot themselves rather than face capture. Some swim into the ocean, preferring drowning to surrender. American forces advance through a landscape of death, securing cave after cave, finding Japanese soldiers who fought until they had nothing left to fight with. The battle is ending, not with a climactic final stand or a dramatic surrender, but with exhaustion. Both sides are simply used up. The Japanese have no more soldiers to spend. The Americans have taken all the territory. What remains is mopping up a sanitized military term that obscures weeks more of dangerous work-clearing holdouts. The human cost of Kian is almost beyond comprehension relative to its size. 20 square miles of peninsula, 6 weeks of fighting. American casualties approach 10,000 killed and wounded, 500 casualties per square mile. Japanese casualties are near total of 30,000 troops defending Kian. Perhaps a few hundred survive to be captured. The rest are killed or commit suicide. It's an annihilation percentage rarely seen in modern warfare. Not a battle where one side defeats the other. A battle where one side ceases to exist. And the survivors, American and Japanese alike, are marked by it permanently. Lieutenant Hagler, who led his company into the assault on June 11th, emerges on June 21 as one of fewer than 50 men left from the original company of 190. He's 23 years old. He looks 40. The Kian endgame is over. The butcher's bill is presented, and everyone who survived understands they survived something that should have killed them. They're not lucky. They're not blessed. They're just statistical outliers in a meat grinder that consumed everyone around them. That's what victory on Kian looks like. That's the endgame. June 18th, 1945, 1300 hours. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner stands on a forward observation post on Misato Ridge, watching the assault on the last Japanese defensive positions through binoculars. He's visiting the front, as he does regularly, believing a commander should see the ground his troops are fighting for. His aide suggests moving to a less exposed position. Japanese artillery occasionally shells this area. Buckner refuses. He wants to see the 2nd Marine Battalion's attack in person, wants to observe how tank infantry coordination is working, wants to assess whether his forces can break through in the next 24 hours. At 13:15, Japanese artillery observers spot the command group. 5 shells are fired from a position miles away, a battery that's been hoarding ammunition for high-value targets. The first 4 shells miss. The 5th shell strikes coral 10 feet from Buckner. Coral fragments, sharp as knives, shred everything in a 15-foot radius. Buckner is hit in the chest. His aide rushes to him, calling for medical evacuation. Buckner tries to speak, but cannot. Blood fills his lungs. Within 10 minutes, he's dead. The highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in World War II. Dead on Okinawa. 4 days before organized resistance officially ends, command of 10th Army passes to Marine General Roy Geiger. But the questions raised by Buckner's death about his strategy, his decisions, his legacy will persist for decades. 600 miles to the south, 4 days later, the Japanese command experiences its own terminal moment. June 22nd, 0400 hours. In a cave system near Mabuni, on Okinawa's southern tip, General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, prepare for ritual suicide. The 32nd Army has been destroyed. Organized resistance is ending. American forces will overrun this position within hours. Ushijima has written final messages to Tokyo, to the emperor, to his family. He's provided instructions for the few hundred soldiers still alive in nearby caves: continue fighting as long as possible, or surrender if you choose. The decision is yours. He's accepted responsibility for the defeat, though he also notes that his forces delayed the American advance for 82 days, exceeding Tokyo's expectations. Now there's nothing left except to die properly. Japanese military tradition demands a commanding officer not be captured. Ushijima has fulfilled his duty. It's time to end this. He dresses in his full uniform, faces toward the imperial palace in Tokyo, though he cannot see it through cave walls, and prepares for seppuku. The contrast between Buckner's death and Ushijima's death reveals fundamental differences between American and Japanese military culture in 1945. Buckner dies by accident while observing combat, exemplifying the American command philosophy that generals should lead from forward positions, should share risks with their troops. It's a philosophy that produces high-ranking casualties, generals dying in Europe, admirals dying in Pacific air raids. But it also produces commanders who understand battlefield conditions personally, who don't make decisions from distant headquarters isolated from reality. Buckner's death is random, meaningless in the way combat deaths are meaningless. A shell happens to land near him. He could have moved 30 seconds earlier and lived, or stayed 30 seconds longer and died. It's chance, impersonal, indifferent. This randomness is particularly American death as accident, not destiny. Ushijima's death is the opposite, carefully choreographed, ritualized, meaningful within its cultural context. Seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, is an ancient samurai tradition that Japanese military officers of 1945 still observe. It's supposed to restore honor after defeat, demonstrate willingness to accept responsibility, show devotion to duty that transcends concern for personal survival. Ushijima kneels, draws a short blade, makes the required cuts while an assistant stands behind him with a sword. At the proper moment, the assistant beheads Ushijima, ensuring death is swift rather than prolonged agony. General Cho follows the same ritual. Both men die according to forms established centuries ago, maintaining composure and dignity to the end. To Western observers, this seems barbaric, archaic, incomprehensible. To the Japanese officers present, it's the only honorable conclusion to a lost battle. The cultural gulf between these perspectives is unbridgeable. Buckner's command legacy is complicated and controversial. Supporters argue he fought a methodical campaign that achieved complete victory at acceptable cost, terrible cost, yes, but acceptable relative to the strategic stakes. Critics argue his refusal to attempt an amphibious flanking maneuver prolonged the campaign unnecessarily and cost thousands of avoidable casualties. The debate becomes particularly sharp when comparing casualty rates. The Marine operations in northern Okinawa, characterized by mobile warfare and aggressive maneuver, produced relatively light casualties. The Army operations in southern Okinawa, characterized by frontal assault against fortified positions, produced catastrophic casualties. Was this difference due to terrain and enemy dispositions, or due to command philosophy? Marine commanders, particularly Geiger, believe the latter. They argue that Buckner's caution, his preference for systematic reduction over bold maneuver, turned the campaign into an unnecessary bloodbath. Army commanders defend Buckner's decisions, arguing that any amphibious landing would have been devastated by kamikazes, and that frontal assault was the only viable option given the circumstances. The irony of Buckner's death, killed days before the campaign's end, too late to change strategy but early enough to miss the victory he orchestrated, is not lost on historians. If he'd died in April, perhaps his successor would have tried different tactics. If he'd survived until June 23rd, he'd be credited with Okinawa's capture. Instead, he dies in a moment of transition, commanding an army that's winning but hasn't won, leaving a legacy that's successful but controversial. His death also raises uncomfortable questions about command presence. Was Buckner's habit of visiting forward positions, courageous leadership, or unnecessary risk-taking? Should the Army commander be exposing himself to artillery fire when his death could disrupt operations at a critical moment? The answers depend on your philosophy of command. But the fact remains, Buckner's death created command instability at the campaign's climax, however briefly, because he insisted on personal observation. Ushijima's legacy is equally complex from the Japanese perspective. He commanded the 32nd Army's defense with considerable skill, adopting Yahara's radical defensive doctrine over the objections of more traditional officers. He maintained discipline and cohesion under impossible conditions, surrounded, outnumbered, facing an enemy with total material superiority. He inflicted casualties on American forces far beyond what their numerical advantage should have permitted. In military terms, Ushijima achieved as much as any Japanese commander could have achieved in his situation. But achievement is measured against objectives. Ushijima was ordered to delay the American invasion of Japan by 90 days. He achieved 82 days, close to the goal. But that delay changed nothing strategically. Japan was still losing the war. The home islands would still be invaded or otherwise forced to surrender. The 32nd Army's destruction bought time, but not hope. So was Ushijima's defense brilliant or futile, effective or wasteful? The answer depends on whether you believe making defeat expensive is worthwhile when defeat is inevitable. Roy Geiger's brief tenure commanding 10th Army 4 days is historically significant despite its brevity. Geiger becomes the only Marine officer to command a field army during World War II, breaking the traditional Army monopoly on multi-corps operations. He assumes command as the campaign is ending, so he cannot implement the maneuver-oriented tactics he advocated earlier. But his elevation to Army command validates Marine tactical philosophy and demonstrates that inter-service rivalry, while present, didn't prevent competent Marines from receiving appropriate commands. Geiger is immediately replaced by General Joseph Stilwell, sent from China to assume permanent command. But those 4 days prove Marines are capable of operational-level command, a fact that influences post-war force structure debates. The circumstances of both commanders' deaths, Buckner's accidental, Ushijima's chosen, reflect the war's final phase nature. By June 1945, the war is decided strategically, but continues operationally, because Japan refuses surrender and America insists on unconditional victory. Buckner dies in a war whose outcome is certain, but whose conclusion remains distant. Ushijima dies, knowing Japan has lost but unable to acknowledge that loss publicly, so he performs the rituals that allow him to maintain personal honor while accepting national defeat. Both deaths are necessary within their respective cultural contexts. Buckner must visit the front because American military culture demands commanders share risk. Ushijima must commit suicide because Japanese military culture demands commanders accept responsibility for defeat. The war kills both men, but in different ways, for different reasons, with different meanings. The human dimensions of command loss emerge in the days following both deaths. American forces, learning of Buckner's death, experience mixed reactions. Frontline troops, exhausted and traumatized, barely register the news one more death in a campaign that's produced tens of thousands. But for his staff and senior commanders, Buckner's death is deeply felt. He wasn't beloved, too stiff, too formal, too old school, but he was competent, steady, professional. His death reminds everyone that rank provides no immunity. If artillery can kill an army commander, it can kill anyone. Japanese forces, learning of Ushijima's suicide, experience something different. Some feel their sacrifice is validated if the commanding general dies with honor, then the common soldiers who've died served honorably too. Others feel abandoned. Ushijima's death is theatrical, carefully staged, while they're expected to die in anonymous cave systems without witnesses or ceremony. The historical treatment of both commanders has evolved over decades. Buckner's reputation suffered immediately post-war, when Marine critics published accounts arguing his strategy was unnecessarily costly. Later reassessments by military historians have been more charitable, acknowledging the difficulty of his situation and the absence of obviously superior alternatives. Ushijima's reputation in Japan is complicated by post-war anti-militarism. For decades, Japanese historians preferred not to discuss the Pacific War at all, making Ushijima a non-entity in popular memory. More recent scholarship has examined his role more carefully, sometimes critically. Why adopt defensive tactics that guaranteed Japanese defeat? Sometimes sympathetically, what else could he have done? Both commanders are trapped in historical amber, forever associated with Okinawa, forever debated by people who weren't there, and don't fully understand the pressures they faced. The final irony is that both commanders are largely forgotten outside military history. Ask average Americans about Okinawa, and they might recall the battle occurred, but won't know Buckner commanded it. Ask average Japanese, and they might not know Ushijima's name at all. The atomic bombs dropped in August overshadow everything that happened at Okinawa in American memory. post-war reconstruction and economic miracle overshadow everything about the war in Japanese memory. Okinawans remember, but Okinawans' voices are often marginalized in both nations' narratives. So, Buckner and Ushijima, who commanded one of history's largest and bloodiest battles, fade into obscurity. Both men died on Okinawa. But their deaths, like the battle itself, are overshadowed by what came after. The commanders fall, the battle ends, history moves on, and the dead, whether they died by accident or by design, by artillery or by sword, remain dead, buried in cemeteries on opposite sides of the Pacific, remembered by fewer people with each passing year, until eventually, perhaps, they're forgotten entirely, just names in history books, just footnotes to a battle that's itself a footnote to the atomic age that followed. June 22nd, 1945, 1100 hours. Admiral Chester Nimitz releases a communique from his headquarters in Guam that will be transmitted across the Pacific and printed in newspapers across America. The battle for Okinawa has been won. Organized resistance has ceased. Lieutenant William Manchester, Marine intelligence officer, reads the statement and nearly laughs. He's standing 50 yards from a cave system that Japanese defenders occupied this morning, a cave that required 3 hours of flamethrower work to clear and cost his unit 2 men killed. Organized resistance has ceased. Try telling that to the Japanese soldier who killed his radio man an hour ago. Try explaining it to the platoon currently fighting through a tunnel complex half a mile south of here. Manchester understands what Nimitz means. The Japanese 32nd Army no longer exists as a coherent fighting force. Command structure has collapsed. Defensive lines have disintegrated. But that's different from saying the fighting has stopped. Thousands of Japanese soldiers are scattered across southern Okinawa, armed, refusing to surrender, capable of killing. They'll continue fighting for weeks. Some will hide in caves for months, emerging to raid supply dumps or attack isolated patrols. Organized resistance has ceased, but the dying hasn't. And it won't for a long time. The official end of the campaign reflects military necessity more than military reality. After 82 days of continuous combat, American forces need to transition from assault operations to occupation and consolidation. Units need rest, casualties need replacing, equipment needs maintenance. The declaration that organized resistance has ended allows this transition to begin, regardless of whether individual Japanese soldiers have stopped fighting. It's a bureaucratic convenience, a line drawn in sand that doesn't quite match the tide, but it serves its purpose. War correspondents file stories about American victory. Strategic planners in Washington incorporate Okinawa into preparations for invading Japan proper. The 10th Army begins reorganizing from assault force into occupation force. And soldiers, officially victorious, continue patrolling and clearing caves and occasionally dying in firefights that aren't supposed to be happening anymore. The reality on the ground, June 22nd, is messy and dangerous. Southern Okinawa contains hundreds of cave systems, many still occupied by Japanese holdouts. Some caves shelter dozens of soldiers with ample ammunition and supplies, capable of defending their positions indefinitely. Other caves hide individual soldiers, armed with nothing but grenades, desperate men who've chosen death over surrender. American forces must clear each cave systematically, a process that's dangerous regardless of whether the cave contains 50 soldiers or 1. The procedure is familiar. By now surround the cave, call for surrender in Japanese, wait for response. If defenders surrender, excellent. If they refuse, use flamethrowers and explosives to kill or seal them inside. It's brutal work, psychologically and physically exhausting, and it continues weeks after organized resistance officially ends. The Japanese concept of surrender, or rather, the absence of that concept, complicates every interaction between American forces and potential prisoners. Japanese military culture teaches that surrender is dishonorable, that dying in battle is preferable to captivity. Soldiers who do consider surrendering often face a different problem: fear. Japanese propaganda has convinced many that Americans torture and execute prisoners. Soldiers who might prefer capture to suicide believe they're choosing between 2 forms of death, so they might as well die fighting. American forces developed techniques to encourage surrender. Nisei translators broadcasting messages into caves, offering food and medical care, promising safety. Sometimes it works, more often it doesn't. The end result is that American forces take remarkably few prisoners relative to the size of the Japanese garrison. Of perhaps 100,000 Japanese military personnel on Okinawa, only 7,400 are captured alive, a 7% survival rate. The rest die fighting, commit suicide, or are sealed in caves. The psychological state of surviving Japanese soldiers in late June ranges from determined resistance to complete breakdown. Some continue fighting because they believe in their cause, because duty demands it, because they cannot conceive of surrender. Others continue fighting because they see no alternative. They cannot surrender without dishonoring their families, cannot retreat because there's nowhere to go. So they fight until death because fighting is all that remains. Still others have essentially lost connection with reality. Weeks underground, inadequate food and water, constant bombardment, watching comrades die, knowing defeat is inevitable. These conditions create mental states that military psychiatry of 1945 has no category for. Modern diagnosis would recognize severe combat trauma, dissociation, psychotic breaks. In 1945, they're just enemy soldiers who refuse to surrender, so they must be killed. The tragedy is that some percentage of Japanese holdouts are no longer capable of rational decision-making, but are treated as hostile combatants rather than traumatized humans needing medical intervention. American patrols in late June and early July encounter Japanese soldiers in varying states of desperation. Some fight with the ferocity of cornered animals. Others seem almost relieved when Americans appear, as if capture absolves them of the responsibility to die honorably. Still others exhibit behavior suggesting complete psychological breakdown, wandering aimlessly, ignoring American presence until shot, or sitting motionless until approached. Marine Corporal E.B. Sledge describes finding a Japanese soldier sitting in a cave, alive but unresponsive, covered in filth, staring at nothing. The Marine Patrol debates what to do. Shooting him seems wrong, he's unarmed and clearly not a threat, but they cannot leave him, cannot spare guards to watch him, cannot carry him back. Eventually, they call a corpsman, who sedates the man and arranges evacuation to a POW camp. Sledge writes later that he doesn't know what became of that soldier, but suspects he never recovered mentally from whatever he'd experienced. The cave system where he was found contained 17 dead Japanese soldiers, suggesting he'd been living with corpses for days or weeks. The process of cave clearing creates its own micro-tragedies. American forces cannot determine cave occupancy without entering, which is dangerous. So, they develop procedures. Blow the entrance, seal the cave, move on. Efficient but absolute, anyone inside dies, combatant or civilian, willing to fight or ready to surrender. Intelligence estimates suggest hundreds of caves are sealed with occupants inside, both military and civilian. Some of these caves are rediscovered decades later. Archaeological excavations find human remains, personal effects, evidence of people who died slowly in darkness as their air supply failed. Modern Okinawans consider these sealed caves mass graves, memorial sites for victims of a battle that continued killing long after organized resistance officially ended. American forces in 1945 have no good options. Clearing caves is dangerous and costly. Sealing caves is efficient but potentially kills people who might have surrendered. They choose efficiency. The ghosts remain. The surrender leaflet campaigns, while well-intentioned, achieve limited success. American aircraft drop millions of leaflets over southern Okinawa, printed in Japanese, promising food, water, medical care, and humane treatment for soldiers who surrender. The leaflets include safe conduct passes. Theoretically, a Japanese soldier holding one of these will not be shot when approaching American lines. In practice, frontline troops are skeptical of anyone approaching their positions, and tragic incidents occur where Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender are killed by Americans who mistake their intentions. The language barrier complicates everything. A Japanese soldier emerging from a cave with hands raised but shouting in Japanese might be surrendering, or might be issuing a defiant challenge before a suicide attack. American troops, after 3 months of combat, default to suspicious. Better to shoot first than be killed by someone you thought was surrendering. The result is that even soldiers who want to surrender often cannot safely do so. The few Japanese soldiers who do surrender provide intelligence that confirms American suspicions. Most holdouts are not fighting because they believe they can win, but because they believe they have no choice. Food has run out, water is scarce, medical supplies are non-existent, wounded soldiers are dying slowly from infected wounds. But surrender remains culturally unacceptable, so they continue fighting with no hope and no purpose except avoiding the dishonor of captivity. American interrogators are struck by the disconnect between the prisoners' descriptions of hopeless situations and their comrades' continued resistance. One prisoner, a corporal from Ushijima's headquarters unit, explains, "We knew the battle was lost in May, but knowing you will die and accepting dishonor are different things. I surrendered only because I was unconscious when captured, so I did not technically surrender. This logic seems bizarre to American interrogators. But it explains why 7% survive and 93% die. The operational transition from combat to occupation creates confusion and danger for frontline units. Officially, the battle is over, which implies different rules of engagement, different procedures, but practically, the battle continues in reduced form. Patrols encounter armed Japanese and must defend themselves. Isolated American positions are still attacked at night. Supply convoys are still ambushed. The distinction between combat operations and security operations is clearer in headquarters than in reality. A Marine on patrol doesn't care whether he's engaged in combat or security. He just knows someone's shooting at him. The bureaucratic declaration that organized resistance has ended doesn't make him safer. It just means his commanders expect fewer casualties, which creates pressure to minimize reported incidents, lest higher headquarters question whether resistance has actually ended. So firefights become security incidents. Ambushes become bandit activity. The dying continues under different terminology. July brings a gradual decrease in combat intensity, but fighting continues sporadically. American forces establish checkpoints and patrol routes, systematically combing southern Okinawa for holdouts. Japanese soldiers, lacking central command and running out of supplies, begin surrendering in slightly larger numbers. By month's end, the daily casualty reports show single digits rather than hundreds. But even single-digit casualties, months after the battle supposedly ended, underscore the gap between official declarations and ground truth. The last organized group of Japanese soldiers, approximately 50 men, led by a lieutenant, surrenders on July 15th, 3 weeks after organized resistance officially ceased. Other individuals hold out longer. Some survivors report Japanese soldiers living in caves through August, emerging only at night to forage for food, avoiding contact with both American forces and Okinawan civilians. The battle's official end date, June 22nd, is correct in a strategic sense, but almost meaningless in a human sense. The casualty accounting for the period after June 22nd reveals the cost of declaring victory prematurely. American forces suffer approximately 300 additional casualties killed and wounded in July and August during mopping up operations. 300 men killed or wounded after the battle officially ended. 300 families receiving telegrams informing them their sons died, securing an island that was already declared secure. The injustice rankles survivors. To die in combat, during a declared battle, at least makes sense within war's logic. To die during mopping up operations, after victory is announced, seems particularly cruel. You survived the worst of it, survived 3 months when death came constantly, only to be killed when everyone thought the danger had passed. Some of these late casualties are from accidents, friendly fire, mishandled explosives, vehicle accidents. Others are from continued Japanese resistance. All are tragedies compounded by timing. The psychological impact on American forces of the extended mopping up phase is subtle but significant. The transition from assault operations where death is expected to occupation operations where death is supposed to be rare creates a cognitive dissonance. Soldiers who maintained composure during intense combat experience breakdowns during the supposedly safe aftermath. It's as if the sustained stress of combat required maintaining a psychological armor that, once no longer necessary, cracks and reveals accumulated trauma underneath. Medical officers report that psychiatric casualties in July and August, while lower in absolute numbers than during peak combat, represent higher percentages of remaining troops. The men who survived are not unscathed. They're damaged in ways that will take years to manifest fully. Combat fatigue, PTSD, before the term exists, survivor's guilt. These conditions don't end when organized resistance ends. They're just beginning. The historical legacy of the Organized Resistance Ends Declaration illustrates how war is understood differently by participants and strategists. From Admiral Nimitz's perspective, the declaration is accurate. The Japanese army is destroyed, strategic objectives are achieved, the campaign is won. From Lieutenant Manchester's perspective, standing outside a cave that still needs clearing, the declaration is premature. People are still fighting and dying. The danger hasn't ended. Victory doesn't feel won. Both perspectives are valid. They're just measuring different things. Strategy versus tactics. Objectives versus experience. The macro versus the micro. The disconnect between these perspectives explains why veterans often feel alienated from official histories. The history books say the battle ended June 22nd. The veterans remember firefights in July, patrols in August, friends killed during mopping up. Which version is true? Both. And neither. Because war doesn't end cleanly. With a final battle and a surrender ceremony and everyone going home, it ends messily, gradually, with scattered fighting that decreases slowly over time until finally, without clear demarcation, the shooting stops. That's what happens on Okinawa. Organized resistance ends June 22nd. But the Battle of Okinawa, the human experience of combat on that island, doesn't truly end until the last Japanese soldier surrenders, the last cave is cleared, the last burial detail finishes its work. That takes months, long after anyone's paying attention, long after the world has moved on to other concerns. The battle is declared over. But for those still there, still working, still dying occasionally, still traumatized by 3 months of horror, the battle continues. Until finally, without announcement or ceremony, it's actually over, and the survivors can begin the long, difficult work of learning to live with what they've experienced, if they can. July 10th, 1945, 1400 hours. In a converted warehouse at the Kadena airfield on Okinawa, Captain Harold Deutsch, 10th Army Statistical Section, compiles the final casualty reports from Operation Iceberg. The numbers accumulate on his desk in neat columns, typed on military forms that reduce human tragedy to statistics. American ground forces, 49,151 total casualties. Killed in action, 12,520. Wounded, 36,631. Missing, 339. Missing usually means dead, but the body wasn't recovered or identifiable. Navy casualties, 4,900 sailors killed, another 4,800 wounded, most from kamikaze attacks. Add those together, and you get American casualties exceeding 54,000. Deutsch stares at the numbers, trying to comprehend their meaning. 54,000 Americans killed or wounded, on one island, in 82 days. That's more than 650 casualties per day, every day, for nearly 3 months. It's more American casualties than the entire European theater suffered in any single month except the Battle of the Bulge. And those are just American numbers. Japanese casualties. 77,000 military personnel confirmed killed, likely higher when accounting for soldiers sealed in caves or buried by bombardment. Okinawan civilian casualties. Estimated between 100,000 and 150,000. Total deaths on Okinawa, over 200,000 people. For one island. Deutsch files his report and tries not to think about what these numbers mean for the planned invasion of Japan. The casualty statistics tell a story of unprecedented bloodshed relative to the operation's size and duration. Okinawa is not the Pacific War's longest battle. That distinction belongs to the Philippines campaign, which lasted nearly a year. It's not the largest in terms of forces engaged. Multiple battles in China involved more troops. but it's the bloodiest in terms of casualty density. 49,000 American casualties for an island 463 square miles in size works out to over 100 casualties per square mile. No other Pacific battle approaches that ratio. Iwo Jima, considered horrifically costly, suffered 7,000 American deaths for 8 square miles, but that's over 3 weeks, not 3 months. Extrapolate Okinawa's casualty rate across the planned invasion of Japan. Kyushu alone is over 5,000 square miles, and the projections become apocalyptic. 500,000 American casualties, perhaps more. These numbers land on desks in Washington, just as planners are finalizing Operation Downfall, and they fundamentally reshape the strategic calculus. How many American mothers will tolerate casualty lists like Okinawa's? How many Okinawas can the country endure before public support for the war collapses? The breakdown of American casualties reveals patterns that inform both tactical and strategic analysis. Infantry casualties are catastrophically disproportionate. The 7 Army and Marine divisions that conducted ground operations suffered casualty rates approaching 35 to 40%. Some rifle companies, the units doing the actual fighting, experienced casualty rates exceeding 80%. This means that in some companies, only 1 in 5 men who landed April 1st was still with the unit in late June. The rest were killed, wounded, or evacuated for combat fatigue. These rates approach World War I levels, the kind of attrition that destroys units as functioning organizations. The fact that American forces continued operating effectively despite such casualties speaks to the quality of replacements and the resilience of military organization, but it also raises uncomfortable questions. If 7 divisions suffer 35% casualties taking one island, how many divisions will be needed to invade Japan, and from where will the replacements come? The naval casualties from kamikaze attacks represent a unique dimension of Okinawa's cost. 4,900 sailors killed exceeds the death toll at Pearl Harbor, yet receives far less historical attention. 36 ships sunk, 368 damaged. Some ships hit by kamikazes are repaired and returned to service. Others are damaged beyond repair and scrapped. The psychological casualties among surviving sailors are substantial. Many ships' crews, after surviving kamikaze attacks, refuse to return to combat duty. Medical officers report unprecedented rates of what would now be called PTSD among naval personnel: flashbacks, nightmares, inability to function under stress. The Navy's response is to rotate crews more frequently, limiting exposure to the kamikaze threat. But this creates its own problems. Inexperienced crews make mistakes, naval efficiency declines. The kamikaze campaign doesn't sink enough ships to threaten the invasion strategically, but it damages the Navy's operational capacity and morale in ways that take months to repair. The psychiatric casualties represent a category of suffering that's rarely discussed, but profoundly important. 26,211 American troops evacuated for combat fatigue during the Okinawa campaign. That's more than the 12,520 killed in action. Combat fatigue, called shell shock in World War I. PTSD today manifests in various ways. Some men become catatonic, unable to move or speak. Others develop uncontrollable shaking, making them incapable of handling weapons. Still others become violently aggressive, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. Some experience psychotic breaks, hallucinating enemy attacks, or believing they're still in combat days after evacuation. The stigma surrounding psychiatric casualties in 1945 means many cases go unreported. Soldiers who should be evacuated remain in line because they don't want to be seen as cowards, or because their units are so depleted that every able body is needed. The long-term consequences are severe. Many men who tough it out through Okinawa develop chronic psychiatric conditions that persist for decades. The Japanese casualty figures, 77,000 military dead, represent near total annihilation. The 32nd Army entered the campaign with approximately 100,000 personnel, including Okinawan conscripts. By campaign's end, over 90% are dead. The 7,400 prisoners taken represent those who surrendered or were captured unconscious. The rest died in place, buried in collapsed caves, killed in banzai charges, committed suicide, or died from wounds and starvation. This casualty rate is unprecedented in modern warfare between industrialized nations. Not even the Eastern Front in Europe, where combat was notoriously brutal, regularly produced 90% casualty rates. The Japanese defensive strategy achieved its objective of maximizing American casualties, but at the cost of complete self-destruction. From a strategic perspective, the 32nd Army succeeded. They delayed the American advance by 82 days, exceeding Tokyo's requirement. From a human perspective, they were annihilated. Whether the strategic success justified the human cost depends on your assessment of whether delaying defeat has value when defeat is inevitable. The Okinawan civilian casualties, 100,000 to 150,000 dead, represent the campaign's greatest tragedy and most enduring scandal. 1/4 of Okinawa's pre-war population died during the battle. Some were killed by American bombardment, caught in combat zones, or sheltering in caves that were targeted. Others were killed by Japanese forces, executed as suspected collaborators, or forced to commit suicide. Still others died from starvation, disease, or exposure while displaced from their homes. The uncertainty about the exact number estimates range across 50,000 people, reflects how little attention was paid to civilian suffering during the battle. Nobody was counting Okinawan dead systematically. American forces counted enemy, military, killed, and their own casualties, but didn't track civilian deaths carefully. Japanese forces certainly weren't counting. Okinawan authorities, such as they were, had no capacity to maintain records during combat, so the exact toll will never be known. Between 100,000 and 150,000. That's as precise as history can be. 100,000 people, give or take 50,000. The imprecision itself is damning. The cost comparison between Okinawa and other operations reveals why the battle so influenced strategic decision-making. Normandy, D-Day, through the breakout from the beachhead, cost approximately 40,000 American casualties over 6 weeks less than Okinawa. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest American battle in Europe, cost approximately 90,000 casualties over 6 weeks, more than Okinawa, but for a larger area and shorter duration. Iwo Jima, considered the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history, cost 26,000 casualties in 5 weeks. Okinawa's casualty toll exceeds all of these, and its duration, 82 days of continuous high-intensity combat, is longer than most battles. The psychological impact on American military leadership is profound. If Okinawa cost 50,000 casualties, what will Kyushu cost? Military intelligence estimates Japanese forces on Kyushu at 300,000 troops. If they fight as effectively as Okinawa's garrison, American casualties could reach 250,000. And Kyushu is just the first phase. Invading Honshu, where Tokyo sits defended by millions of troops and mobilized civilians, could cost 1,000,000 American casualties. These projections, extrapolated from Okinawa's casualty rates, fundamentally reshape strategic thinking about how to end the war. The medical dimension of Okinawa's casualties reveals both triumph and tragedy. The survival rate for wounded Americans who reached medical facilities exceeded 90%, a remarkable achievement reflecting advances in battlefield medicine. Plasma, penicillin, rapid evacuation to hospital ships, these innovations saved thousands of lives. But survival doesn't mean wholeness. Many wounded soldiers lost limbs to amputation, necessary to prevent infection in an environment where antibiotics were scarce. Others suffered injuries that left them permanently disabled: paralysis from spinal wounds, blindness from head trauma, disfigurement from burns. The medical triumphs that kept these men alive also meant they'd spend the rest of their lives dealing with disabilities that would have been death sentences in previous wars. For some families, the telegram that read "wounded" was relief their son survived. For others, it marked the beginning of decades of caregiving for sons who came home broken. The economic cost of Okinawa, while harder to quantify than human casualties, was substantial. The American military expended millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of tons of explosives, hundreds of vehicles and aircraft. Ships damaged by kamikazes cost millions to repair or replace. The infrastructure required to support 183,000 troops for 3 months: food, fuel, medicine, equipment, represented industrial output that could have been used elsewhere. Japan's economic cost was proportionally worse aircraft, ships, and munitions expended in the kamikaze campaign, and ground defense represented resources that couldn't be replaced. The 32nd Army's destruction removed 100,000 trained troops from Japan's order of battle at a time when manpower was critically scarce. Okinawa's own economic infrastructure was obliterated. Every major building destroyed, agriculture disrupted. The port facilities, cities, roads, all would require years to rebuild. The battle's economic impact rippled through the region for decades. The strategic assessment of whether Okinawa's cost was worth it depends entirely on your perspective and time frame. From the American strategic perspective, in June 1945, Okinawa was necessary despite the cost. It provided airfields within range of Japan, staging areas for the invasion, and demonstrated to Japan that continued resistance would result in total destruction. The casualties, while terrible, were acceptable relative to strategic objectives. But with hindsight, knowing that atomic bombs would end the war without invading Japan, Okinawa's cost seems less justified. If the war was going to end in August anyway, why fight for 3 months in June? The answer, of course, is that nobody knew in June what would happen in August. Decisions were made with available information, and that information suggested Okinawa was necessary. The tragedy is that 50,000 American casualties were necessary for a stepping stone to an invasion that never happened. The human meaning of these statistics, the 50,000 American casualties, the 77,000 Japanese dead, the 100,000 civilian deaths, transcends numbers. Each casualty represents a person with a name, a family, a life unlived. The 19-year-old Marine from Iowa, who died on Sugarloaf Hill, had parents who grieved, siblings who remembered him, a future that vanished in coral and blood. The Japanese soldier who fought until starvation killed him in a cave with someone's son, perhaps someone's father, a person who loved and was loved. The Okinawan child who died in an artillery barrage had barely begun living, had dreams and fears and potential that was extinguished without ever being realized. Numbers make war comprehensible. 50,000 casualties can be written in ledgers, analyzed, compared to other battles. But numbers also obscure war's reality. Behind every statistic is a human being who suffered and died. The bill for Okinawa was paid in blood, pain, grief, and trauma. It was paid by young men who fought and died on a battlefield. It was paid by families who received telegrams and spent the rest of their lives wondering, what if? It was paid by survivors who carried physical and psychological scars for decades. It was paid by Okinawans who lost everything: homes, families, culture, innocence. The bill for Okinawa is still being paid, 80 years later, by a generation that remembers and a generation that inherited their trauma. That's the real cost, not the numbers. The people behind the numbers, and the absence those people left behind when they died on an island most Americans can't find on a map, fighting for reasons many of them didn't fully understand, paying with their lives for strategic objectives they'd never benefit from. That's the bill. And it came due in full on Okinawa, June 1945. Paid in blood, every last drop. August 15th, 1945, noon. Private First Class Eugene Sledge sits with his Marine squad in a tent city on Okinawa's southern coast, listening to a crackling radio broadcast. Emperor Hirohito's voice, speaking publicly for the first time in recorded history, announces Japan's surrender. The war is over. The Marines around Sledge should be celebrating 3 years of island warfare, 3 years of watching friends die, 3 years of living in constant fear, and finally it's over. But nobody celebrates. They sit in silence, processing information their minds cannot quite accept. The invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, which they've been training for and dreading, won't happen. The hundreds of thousands of casualties predicted for that invasion won't occur. They're going to live. They're going home. Sledge writes later that his overwhelming emotion wasn't joy but confusion. What do you do with trauma you've been accumulating for years when suddenly the reason for that trauma disappears? They sacrificed everything for victory. Now victory is here, and it feels empty, meaningless. just an ending to something that should never have begun. Around them, Okinawa continues functioning as a massive American military base, occupied territory transforming into permanent installation. The battle is over, but Okinawa's story is just beginning. The immediate aftermath for American forces involves complex emotions and difficult transitions. Veterans of the Okinawa campaign learn simultaneously that the war has ended and that their sacrifice hastened that ending. The invasion of Japan won't happen, partly because Okinawa's casualty rates convinced American leadership that invasion was too costly. The atomic bombs, dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, ended the war that Okinawa's casualty projections suggested might consume 1 million American lives. So in a grotesque way, every soldier who died on Okinawa contributed to ending the war. Their deaths provided the data that made atomic weapons seem preferable to invasion. But that's cold comfort to survivors. Would their friends still be alive if the bombs had been dropped in April? Questions like that have no good answers, only speculation and guilt. Many Okinawa veterans report feeling simultaneously relieved the war is over and angry that their suffering seems, in retrospect, unnecessary. If atomic bombs could end the war in days, why fight for months on Okinawa? The logic doesn't hold. Nobody knew about the bomb's effectiveness until they were used, but logic doesn't govern trauma. For Japanese survivors, the 7,400 prisoners of war and scattered holdouts still hiding in caves, the Emperor's surrender broadcast creates cognitive dissonance bordering on psychological break. Japanese military indoctrination for 3 years has taught that surrender is unthinkable, that Japan will fight until every citizen is dead rather than submit to occupation. Now the Emperor himself, considered divine, is announcing surrender. How do you reconcile that? Some prisoners report relief, the burden of honor is lifted, they can stop pretending they want to die. Others report despair, everything they believed, everything they suffered for, was based on lies. The Emperor wasn't divine. Japanese spirit couldn't overcome material disadvantage. The war was lost, and they were sacrificed for nothing. A small number of holdouts refused to believe the broadcast, convinced it's American propaganda. These soldiers continue living in caves, emerging to raid food, convinced they're the only remaining loyal troops. Some won't surrender until the 1970s, decades later, when they're finally convinced the war really ended. Their isolation in caves, without information, freezes them in August 1945, psychologically, while the world moves on. Okinawan civilians, emerging from caves and internment camps, find their island unrecognizable. Southern Okinawa, where the heaviest fighting occurred, is a moonscape. Every building destroyed, every tree shattered, fields cratered by artillery and bombs. The ancient capital city of Shuri is rubble. The castle, centuries old, is obliterated. Villages that existed for generations are simply gone, not damaged, gone, with nothing remaining to indicate they ever existed. Families return to former home sites and find nothing but coral dust and unexploded ordnance. The psychological trauma of this destruction compounds the trauma of the battle itself. Okinawans didn't just lose family members, they lost their entire world. The culture, architecture, history that defined Okinawa was systematically destroyed. What returns from the ruins is something different, something that will be shaped more by American occupation than by Okinawan tradition. The American occupation of Okinawa begins immediately after the battle ends and continues for 27 years, until 1972. This is longer than the actual battle by a factor of hundreds, but it receives far less historical attention. American forces, having secured the island at such cost, have no intention of giving it up. Okinawa's strategic location close to Japan, China, Korea, and Southeast Asia makes it invaluable for Cold War military positioning. Construction begins immediately on what will become some of the largest American military installations outside the continental United States. Kadena Air Base expands to accommodate B-29 bombers and eventually jet aircraft. Marine bases are constructed across central Okinawa. Naval facilities occupy coastal areas. At peak, 20% of Okinawa's land area, an island that's already small and densely populated, is appropriated for American military use. Okinawans are displaced, forced to relocate to make room for bases, compensated inadequately, if at all. The same people who lost everything in the battle now lose their land to the occupation. The cultural impact of American occupation reshapes Okinawan society fundamentally. English becomes essential for economic survival. Working for the American military is one of few employment opportunities available. American currency, American goods, American music, American culture flood the island. Traditional Okinawan practices, already suppressed by decades of Japanese assimilation efforts, are further marginalized. Young Okinawans grow up in a hybrid culture, Okinawan at home, Japanese in school, American in the streets. The old Okinawa, the independent Ryukyu kingdom culture that existed before Japanese annexation, becomes increasingly difficult to preserve. Some aspects survive language, food, religious practices, but transformed, adapted, mixed with Japanese and American influences. The Battle of Okinawa didn't just kill Okinawans. It killed a way of life, a culture, an identity that can never be fully recovered. For American veterans, the return home is complicated by the difficulty of explaining what they experienced. How do you describe Okinawa to people who weren't there? How do you make them understand the constant fear, the omnipresent death, the way combat changes you fundamentally? Most veterans don't try. They return home, resume civilian lives, and bury Okinawa deep in their minds. Many don't discuss their experiences for decades, if ever. Families learn not to ask. What did you do in the war, Dad? I served in the Pacific. That's the extent of the conversation. The silence around Okinawa is profound and damaging. Veterans suffer nightmares, flashbacks, depression, substance abuse, all symptoms of what we now recognize as PTSD. But in 1945, there's minimal treatment or support. You're expected to adjust, to get over it, to be grateful you survived. Many can't. Okinawa veterans have elevated rates of suicide, divorce, and psychiatric hospitalization compared to veterans of other battles. The correlation between combat intensity and long-term psychological damage is clear, but the society they return to lacks the framework to help them. The memorial culture surrounding Okinawa develops slowly and inadequately. Unlike Iwo Jima, where the flag-raising photograph creates an iconic image, Okinawa lacks a single defining visual symbol. Unlike D-Day, where the liberation narrative provides clear moral framework, Okinawa's massive civilian casualties complicate the heroism narrative. American memorials to Okinawa exist: plaques, monuments, cemetery sections for the dead, but they're less prominent than memorials to other battles. The battle fades from public memory, overshadowed by the atomic bombs that follow. School textbooks mention Okinawa briefly, if at all. Popular culture ignores it in favor of more dramatic battles. The veterans feel forgotten, their sacrifice unacknowledged. This forgetting compounds their trauma. Not only did they survive something horrible, but nobody seems to care. Okinawans develop their own memorial culture, most prominently the Cornerstone of Peace Memorial, which lists every name Japanese, American, Okinawan without distinction. It's a powerful statement. War kills indiscriminately, and memory should acknowledge all victims. But the memorial is on Okinawa, visited primarily by Okinawans and Japanese, rarely by Americans. The forgetting continues. The long-term health consequences of Okinawa combat manifest over decades. Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants, used experimentally on Okinawa to clear vegetation, cause elevated cancer rates among veterans who handled them. Asbestos, ubiquitous in military equipment of the era, produces mesothelioma decades later. But the most persistent health issue is psychological. Okinawa veterans experience PTSD symptoms at rates significantly higher than veterans of other Pacific battles. The intensity and duration of combat, combined with societal pressure to suppress trauma, creates conditions for chronic psychological damage. Many veterans self-medicate with alcohol, leading to substance abuse problems. Others withdraw from social contact, isolating themselves. Family relationships suffer. Wives describe husbands who are physically present but emotionally absent, trapped in memories of Okinawa they cannot share and cannot escape. The Veterans Administration, recognizing these patterns belatedly, eventually provides PTSD treatment, but for many veterans, it comes decades too late. The damage is done. The geopolitical legacy of Okinawa extends into the 21st century. American military bases remain on Okinawa in 2025. 80 years after the battle, 32,000 American military personnel are stationed there, along with 50,000 dependents. The bases are controversial. Okinawans resent the land appropriation, the crimes occasionally committed by military personnel, the noise from aircraft. Periodic protests demand base closure or relocation. But the bases remain because Okinawa's strategic location hasn't changed. It's still close to potential conflict zones in Northeast Asia. It's still valuable as a military asset. The Battle of Okinawa, in a very real sense, never ended for Okinawans. The American military presence, originally established to support the invasion of Japan that never happened, became permanent. Okinawans who lost family in the battle now live next to the bases those family members died fighting against. The irony is bitter. The Battle of Okinawa's place in Japanese historical memory is complicated by Japan's broader difficulty confronting wartime atrocities. Textbooks in Japan mention Okinawa but minimize Japanese military abuse of Okinawan civilians. The narrative emphasizes heroic defense and American brutality, while downplaying or ignoring Japanese executions of Okinawans, forced suicides, and military appropriation of civilian resources. This selective memory infuriates Okinawans, who feel their suffering is being exploited for Japanese nationalist purposes, while the Japanese government denies responsibility. The tension between Okinawan and Japanese memory of the battle reflects broader tensions about Okinawan identity. Are they Japanese, or a distinct people occupied by Japan? The battle crystallized this question without answering it. Okinawa is legally Japanese after 1972, but culturally and politically, many Okinawans feel neither fully Japanese nor fully independent. The battle that destroyed their island also destroyed their ability to choose their own identity. The human stories of aftermath are where history becomes personal. Eugene Sledge returns to Alabama, struggles with PTSD for years, eventually becomes a biology professor, and writes about Okinawa decades later. His memoir, With the Old Breed, becomes one of the definitive accounts of Pacific War combat. Masahide Ota, the 12-year-old boy who survived in a cave with his grandmother, becomes a historian documenting civilian experiences. His work ensures Okinawan civilian suffering isn't forgotten entirely, though it remains marginalized in broader historical narratives. Japanese prisoners, repatriated after the war, face discrimination in Japan for having surrendered. Some never reintegrate successfully, haunted by shame and trauma. American mothers of sons killed on Okinawa form informal support networks, corresponding for decades, bound by shared grief. These personal stories, multiplied by tens of thousands, constitute the real aftermath, not strategic assessments or geopolitical consequences, but human beings trying to process trauma and loss and survive in a world shaped by violence they didn't choose and can't escape. The Battle of Okinawa ended August 1945, but its aftermath continues. In the nightmares of veterans now in their 90s, in the political tensions over American bases, in the gaps in Okinawan genealogies where entire families disappeared, in the unexploded ordnance still discovered regularly, killing or maiming people decades after the